This is going to absolutely astound you, challenging everything you thought you knew about the nature of ancient dominion and divine consequence. Based on meticulously preserved historical documentation and the dramatic accounts meticulously detailed in Scripture, King Nebuchadnezzar II wasn't merely governing an immense, sprawling empire. He was commanding the very structure, the definitive absolute benchmark, that would serve as the model for every single kingdom that dared to rise in his wake. We're discussing a singular ruler who strategically laid claim to more territory than Alexander the Great would ever eventually conquer, a man who financed and constructed architectural wonders that seemed, by all accounts, to utterly defy the known laws of physics, and who then descended into a state of profound, terrifying madness so complete that he lived as a primitive, wild creature for 7 full, agonizing years. But here is the devastating, crucial piece of the narrative most people never fully learn or internalize. His horrifying, transformative journey includes one of the most powerful and staggering redemption stories ever documented in the historical record. And the profound, inescapable wisdom we can draw from studying his meteoric ascent and catastrophic descent carries far more weight in our complex, modern world than you might possibly imagine. But before we fully immerse ourselves in the golden gates and the desert dust, if this is your very first time encountering this channel and our stories, take a moment to consider tapping that like button and hitting the subscribe notification. It genuinely makes an enormous difference to our mission. Also, we genuinely love to connect with you. Please drop a quick comment below telling us your location and the current time where you are right now. So, with that crucial request made, let's dive right into the heart of the chronicle, shall we? A shadowy, broken figure moves, low to the ground, deep within the tangled scrub and whispering tall grasses, maneuvering on knuckles and knees. The man's hair is a horrifying mass. Twisted, matted ropes, impossibly wild, rendering his face utterly unrecognizable. Dirt, dried mud, and animal waste encrust his body, a second, filthy skin. His fingernails have elongated and thickened into grotesque, claw-like formations that scrape the soil. He consumes the prairie grass with the desperate, ripping motion of livestock, tearing the vegetation directly from the ground with his mouth. This broken being, reduced to a primal state, was previously the single most dominant monarch in existence. Rulers of vassal states across continents shook with visceral fear at the very sound of his title. His military forces, disciplined and vast, moved with destructive efficiency at his slightest, whispered wish. Urban centers of long-standing opposition collapsed swiftly beneath the concentrated weight of his siege strength. Precious metals and vast tributes poured into his royal coffers like an unstoppable, flowing river. The mightiest dominion the planet had witnessed, spanning the known world, answered unequivocally to his authority. Now, he feeds indiscriminately in open fields, indistinguishable from the cattle. His identity was Nebuchadnezzar. He governed Babylon during its breathtaking zenith, a period of unprecedented global authority and cultural flourishing. He created engineering marvels that left the world speechless and mystified. He subjugated territories far and wide and seized their unimaginable riches. He experienced terrifying, prophetic visions that destabilized entire realms and shifted the course of history. He controlled the destiny, the life and death of countless souls. Yet here he remains, shattered, forsaken, and insane. His consciousness is fragmented, scattered like wind-blown foliage across the desolate plain. The great royal crown, plated in hammered gold, lies abandoned and forgotten within the treasury. The monumental seat of power, the very throne of the world, stands vacant and gathering dust. The dominion waits in suspended, fearful anticipation, paralyzed by the absence of its ultimate leader. What terrible force, what mechanism of fate, could have caused this complete, catastrophic transformation? How does a monarch who declares himself an equivalent to the divine finish his days consuming vegetation alongside the grazing animals? What power on earth or heaven could possess the capacity to topple such absolute authority? What arrogance could possibly warrant such a severe, devastating penalty? The narrative, paradoxically, doesn't begin in the mud, but with blinding magnificence. Picture it. Walls plated in gold that seem to tear the very sky, terraced gardens floating impossibly high like heaven's clouds captured by mortal hands, majestic gateways adorned in brilliant azure tiles that instantly captured the dawn's first ethereal rays. This was a metropolis that appeared visibly blessed and sanctioned by celestial forces, a city built to last forever. But magnificence, especially of that scale, always demands its eventual cost. Authority requires its ultimate tribute, and occasionally the debt arrives in terrifying forms that nobody, not even a king, anticipates. The mightiest sovereigns frequently experience the hardest, most humiliating collapses. The strongest, most enduring dominions dissolve like dry desert sand beneath the weight of time. The most prideful, arrogant spirits shatter against invisible, incomprehensible forces that they neither acknowledged nor understood. This becomes that definitive chronicle, a stark narrative of breathtaking elevation and crushing collapse, of absolute authority swallowed by profound insanity, of terrifying visions and their truly devastating price. It is a story that traces backward, commencing in the dust of a shattered mind and moving against the current of time to reveal precisely how dominions are constructed, brick by agonizing brick, and how swiftly they can utterly incinerate. Nebuchadnezzar believed, in his final, soaring moments of hubris, that he could grasp the celestial bodies themselves. Instead, he discovered precisely what it meant to share meals with the lowest of the wild beasts. The painful, necessary passage between these two states transformed the world permanently. Watch as the scene dissolves. Observe the untamed figure raising his face toward the massive, indifferent heavens, eyes utterly devoid of awareness or recognition. Shortly, you'll begin to comprehend the dreadful series of events that led him to this unimaginable state. Shortly, you'll discover the true, uncompromising cost of considering yourself equivalent to divine, eternal beings. The chronicle of Babylon's mightiest sovereign commences not with his triumphant arrival into the world, but with his complete and absolute downfall. Everything flows in reverse from this instantaneous moment of complete degradation. From refined precious metal to coarse prairie grass, from the gilded royal seat to the cold, hard earth, from sovereign monarch to mere creature. This reveals how dominions genuinely conclude, not through thunderous war cries or the sound of crumbling fortifications, but through a devastated, humbled individual slowly rediscovering the last, lost fragments of his own essential humanity. Introduction. Babylon in destruction and magnificence. Babylon was born precisely at the confluence where two life-giving waterways, the mighty Tigris and the surging Euphrates, converged. These rivers served as the living arteries, transporting immense vitality through vast arid territories, causing lush greenery to flourish in locations that should have remained perpetually barren. Here, nestled between these flowing channels, arose the most spectacular, defiant metropolis the classical world had ever dared to imagine. Defensive fortifications soared higher than natural peaks, walls so massively engineered that chariots could race abreast along their fortified summits without fear. Azure, deep blue tiles adorned the magnificent Ishtar gateways that parted like portals to some secret, opulent paradise. The suspended gardens cascaded in dizzying, stepped levels, verdant, abundant, and so beautiful, nourished by complex water systems that appeared to defy gravity itself through sheer enchantment and human will. Structures reached ceaselessly toward the atmosphere, each massive tier painted in pigments so rich they seemed to ignite at dusk. This exceeded mere urban development or engineering prowess. This constituted an absolute declaration inscribed in monumental masonry and blinding precious metal. It proudly proclaimed that mortal craftsmanship could, in fact, construct wonders vast and enduring enough to match the grandest divine creations. Monarchs governed here who not only aspired to but truly believed they could grasp immortality. They etched their identities and achievements deep into barriers that would easily survive their mortal remains. They relentlessly accumulated wealth and knowledge from every single territory of the recognized world. They directed military forces that swept across terrain like devastating, unstoppable tempests. But such absolute authority arrives burdened with an inescapable darkness. When mortals ascend too far, too fast, something observes patiently from the heights. When realms grow excessively proud and hubristic, Cosmic powers assemble themselves to brutally restore their proper position. The supreme among these exceptional monarchs was Nebuchadnezzar. His identity resonated like a heavy gong through governmental corridors and the most sacred temple spaces. Young ones mastered speaking his name with hushed awe. Adversaries uttered it only with palpable dread. His governance signified the pivotal moment when Babylon genuinely touched the sky and seized its destiny. Yet, even as he constructed his magnificent towers ever higher, more sinister forces moved underneath, silent and unseen. Visions plagued his rest. Prophecies revealed complex futures far beyond his limited comprehension. A lone Hebrew oracle traversed his gilded halls, uttering strange, unsettling words that penetrated the royal luxury like a sudden, frigid wind. This becomes the chronicle of how unprecedented splendor and inevitable condemnation moved as partners. How a sovereign's grandest victories unknowingly planted the very foundations of his most peculiar, humiliating downfall. How a dominion that appeared everlasting quickly understood the terrifying burden of divine focus. Babylon blazed brilliantly in those times. Its illumination extended across all recognized territories, attracting merchants laden with silk, hardened warriors seeking fortune, and visionaries chasing ancient wisdom. Precious metal flowed so abundantly it seemed common. Understanding accumulated in archives and libraries that competed with celestial bodies for sheer quantity. Creative expression and art prospered in dazzling manifestations never previously conceived. But radiance generates profound darkness. The greater the intensity of the blaze, the deeper its potential descent. And from beyond the illumination, something observed, patient and all-knowing, awaiting the perfect instant to remind even the loftiest sovereign that they remained, fundamentally, merely human. Babylon's flames of magnificence would consume for many decades, but they would likewise ultimately devour the very individual who stoked them highest. This becomes that chronicle, the terrifying account of a sovereign who constructed wonders and permanently surrendered his sanity, who conquered the planet and tragically misplaced his own essential humanity, who stretched upward toward paradise and discovered himself consuming grass with the creatures. Enter now into that golden metropolis. Traverse those impossible pathways. Inhale the thick atmosphere dense with frankincense, fragrance, and blinding aspiration. Encounter the sovereign who imagined he could exist eternally and understand how even the tallest, most defiant structures must ultimately collapse. Historical context. Prior to Nebuchadnezzar's rise, the classical world was an unstable tableau, violently reforming itself. Ancient, long-established authorities disintegrated like parched, shattered clay. Fresh, ambitious kingdoms emerged swiftly from their remnants. The territorial map of dominion altered almost continuously as vast military forces marched repeatedly and ruthlessly across desert wastes and fertile river valleys. For generations, Assyria had reigned supreme, governing with a terrorizing, brutal strength. Their armies consumed the recognized world like a relentless plague of devastating insects, consuming everything, leaving only ruin behind them. Metropolitan areas that dared to oppose were utterly obliterated, erased from memory. Populations that revolted were brutally dispersed across vast continents to prevent future organization. Monarchs who dared challenge them were pulled in humiliating restraints through Assyrian thoroughfares. But even iron eventually corrodes. Even the strongest military forces grow exhausted and brittle. By the 7th century before our era, profound fractures appeared in Assyrian authority. Uprisings ignited in remote territories. Tribute deliveries diminished sharply. Faithful administrators commenced contemplating the perilous, treasonous possibility of defection. In Babylon, an astute and ambitious local leader named Nebuchadnezzar observed these fractures not with fear, but with cold, sharp perception. He had previously assisted the Assyrian overlords, gathering their levies, implementing their harsh regulations, but deep within his core, ancient, powerful aspirations awakened. Aspirations of a time when Babylon itself had commanded these territories and set the rules. The metropolis recalled its magnificent past. Elderly individuals recounted stirring chronicles of Hammurabi, who had delivered sophisticated legal codes to civilization centuries prior. Sacred ministers recited ancient ancestry extending backward to the very times of creation. The fortifications themselves appeared to murmur of classical grandeur awaiting resurrection. Nabopolassar commenced gathering supporters discreetly, initially, then with increasing audacity and confidence. The Medes toward the eastern regions shared his deep contempt for Assyrian governance. Lesser kingdoms provided covert, strategic assistance. Even certain key Assyrian commanders grew deeply weary of perpetual conflicts that delivered minimal compensation or rest. The precise moment arrived in 626 before our Common Era. Nabopolassar boldly proclaimed separation from Assyrian control. He announced himself sovereign of Babylon and immediately prepared for the inevitable, brutal conflict. The ancient dominion would not surrender its immense treasure without resistance. Bloodshed would flow like the mighty waterways before the confrontation concluded. But Nabopolassar had selected his timing wisely and meticulously. Assyria confronted adversaries along every single frontier. Their military forces were extended dangerously thinly, their reserves nearly depleted. The aggressive warriors who had previously terrorized civilization now glanced anxiously backward, questioning when fortune would reverse itself against them. Still, the conflict extended across many painful years. Metropolitan areas exchanged possession like gaming pieces. Military forces marched and reversed course across ravaged territories, leaving trails of destruction. Complete populations abandoned their residences, pursuing safety wherever they could discover it. Into this relentless realm of shifting power and constant, desperate conflict, a prince was born, Nabopolassar's direct male offspring, the living embodiment of restored Babylonian ambition. The infant who would ultimately be named Nebuchadnezzar entered a kingdom where power was the only definition of survival, and vulnerability meant absolute extinction. He matured, watching his father battle fiercely for every span of conquered territory. He absorbed the harsh lesson that authority must be claimed, maintained with violent hands, and protected against every perceived danger. The youth assimilated the intense instructions of conflict and governance like absorbent material drinking the precious liquid surrounding him. The ancient Assyrian realm perished in flames and disorder. But from those fiery remnants, something fresh, potent, and terrifying was emerging. Something that would illuminate more brilliantly than anything preceding it. The foundation was established for a dominion that would astound civilization with its magnificence and terrorize it with its strength. Shortly, very shortly, that prince would claim the throne, and then the authentic chronicle of Babylon's zenith would commence. Nebuchadnezzar, the successor prince. The prince absorbed military science long before he mastered the complex script of cuneiform. Nabopolassar made certain his son understood that true authority flowed from the blade's edge, not merely the quill. Court instructors educated him regarding tactical maneuvers and strategic planning. Experienced, battle-hardened warriors demonstrated how to grip a lance effectively, how to direct from a mounted position, and, most crucially, how to generate absolute devotion in individuals who confront mortality for his purpose. Nebuchadnezzar assimilated these instructions with intense, chilling concentration. While alternative royal offspring engaged with playthings and childish distractions, he meticulously studied the campaign maps of rival territories. While they absorbed court entertainment and fleeting pleasures, he committed to memory the identities of opposing commanders and their exploitable vulnerabilities. His preparation was total, a ruthless readiness for the magnificent throne that would someday belong to him. The youth displayed early, unmistakable indications of his future character. Rapid to fury when opposed, utterly merciless in seeking strategic benefit, exceptional at perceiving configurations and tactical gaps others overlooked entirely. He possessed that terrifying, rare combination of penetrating intellect and limitless ambition that either constructs dominions that last millennia or annihilates them entirely. By 15 years, he accompanied his father's military forces not as mere decoration or a figurehead, but as a fully functional, ruthless component of the conflict apparatus. He mastered resting on rigid, cold ground, consuming provisions that would sicken less hardy individuals, making instant, life-or-death determinations when existence is balanced in uncertainty. The grueling expedition route became his authentic educational institution. His initial autonomous authority arrived during a calculated assault against critical Assyrian provision routes. The adversary had grown negligent, assuming themselves protected behind allied territory. Nebuchadnezzar swiftly demonstrated their error. His attack was rapid, perfectly timed, merciless, and absolutely definitive. Information of the triumph reached Babylon, preceding his arrival, transported by displaced persons who portrayed him as a supernatural force embodied in mortal form. Nabopolassar displayed immense satisfaction when he received the accounts. His offspring was progressing admirably, perhaps even excessively well. The sovereign occasionally detected glimpses of something profoundly disturbing in the prince's intense gaze, an appetite for power that surpassed typical aspiration, a chilling detachment that indicated psychological depths even a paternal figure might prefer not exploring. But these constituted perilous times. They demanded perilous individuals. The prince's sharpness might slice in multiple directions, but it would penetrate deeply and decisively when directed against Babylon's adversaries. That was the current priority. Court witnesses observed Nebuchadnezzar with a combined dread and captivation. He navigated through the governmental complex like a confined hunter, perpetually vigilant, perpetually calculating his next move. Aristocratic offspring watched with fascination when he passed, but he scarcely acknowledged them. His entire concentration remained fixed on warfare and complex governance matters. The prince encircled himself only with individuals who wholeheartedly embraced his grand perspective of restored Babylonian magnificence. Young commanders who aspired to continental subjugation. Administrators who minutely examined the governmental approaches of triumphant vast dominions. Designers who drafted audacious plans for fortifications and structures that would exceed anything constructed previously in history. Already he was contemplating far beyond the present conflict. Triumph over Assyria was merely the commencement. The genuine prize was the global dominion that would emerge definitively from Assyrian remnants. A dominion entirely focused on Babylon, extracting wealth and tribute from every territory of the recognized world. His paternal generation battled to escape foreign governance. Nebuchadnezzar's generation would battle to enforce their own governance on all others. The distinction manifested clearly in how they confronted their adversaries. Nabopolassar pursued independence. His offspring aspired ruthlessly to absolute supremacy. The prince's standing extended rapidly beyond Babylon's immediate frontiers. Adversary commanders commenced planning their approaches around his probable battlefield presence. Associated sovereigns requested him specifically when they required consultation on critical military affairs. He remained youthful, but already his word carried an influence that would have impressed experienced veterans. Yet, despite his rapidly expanding fame, Nebuchadnezzar remained his father's offspring and successor. He submitted to Nabopolassar's wisdom, executed royal directives without challenge, presented himself as the dutiful, beautiful prince the court anticipated observing. But those who understood him thoroughly occasionally questioned what profound, calculating contemplations moved behind those analytical, cold eyes. The Battle of Carchemish. The ancient, heavily fortified metropolis of Carchemish dominated the critical crossing point where the Euphrates curved sharply toward the western territories. Whoever possessed this location controlled the vital pathways between Mesopotamia and the Mediterranean coastline. For generations, military forces had sacrificed countless lives for the privilege to position their standards on its fortifications. Now, Egypt and Babylon confronted each other across those bitterly disputed ramparts. Pharaoh Necho had proceeded northward with the most excellent military force Egypt could possibly assemble. He aspired to revitalize his predecessor's dominion of extending the Nile's authority from Memphis to the distant Euphrates. Opposing him was young Nebuchadnezzar, directing the full Babylonian forces for the initial occasion without his father's immediate, watchful supervision. The two vast military forces established camps within visual range of each other. Egyptian war vehicles gleamed fiercely in the dawn illumination, their bronze attachments capturing radiance like imprisoned celestial bodies. Babylonian foot soldiers formed precise, disciplined formations, their forest of long lances creating walls of iron tips. Between them rested the ultimate prize that would establish the authority balance for generations approaching. Nebuchadnezzar dedicated the entire night preceding the battle traversing among his forces. He conversed quietly with experienced commanders, divided bread with anxious recruits, inspected armaments and protection with the intense attention of a craftsman readying his instruments. His mere presence stabilized individuals who had never participated in such a vital, world-altering engagement. When dawn emerged, the prince ascended an elevation where he could observe the complete battlefield array. Egyptian forces were already advancing, their combat formations extending like a golden serpent across the flatland. War vehicles assumed positions on the peripheries while heavy foot soldiers progressed in the middle. It constituted a formation that had conquered half the recognized world. But Nebuchadnezzar had examined Egyptian methods with clinical precision. He understood their capabilities and, more significantly, their critical limitations. Egyptian military forces excelled at impact and velocity, but they struggled in extended, grinding engagements. Their provision routes extended thinly across enormous distances. Their commanders occasionally permitted triumph enthusiasm to obscure their better wisdom. The prince had readied accordingly. His substantial, disciplined foot soldiers would receive the main Egyptian assault, diminishing their force while surrendering territory progressively and slowly. Meanwhile, Babylonian mounted forces, utilizing superior speed, would attack the adversary peripheries and posterior, strategically severing provision routes and retreat pathways. It constituted a patient approach that demanded iron restraint and flawless, immediate coordination across the entire battle line. The confrontation commenced with the thunderous roar of hooves and the terrifying collision of bronze against iron. Egyptian war vehicles crashed into Babylonian formations like hammers contacting anvils. For an instant, it appeared the assault might triumph. Separations emerged in the protecting ranks. Egyptian foot soldiers flooded through, advancing their benefit with desperate bravery. Then Nebuchadnezzar's snare sealed shut. Fresh reinforcements filled the separations while mounted forces attacked swiftly from unexpected angles. Egyptian formations, extended thinly by their aggressive progression, commenced to collapse under the converging force. What had appeared like triumph transformed swiftly into disarray, then panicked withdrawal, then complete, utter defeat. By evening, Egyptian authority in Mesopotamia was shattered, definitively and permanently. Pharaoh Necho escaped southward with the remnants of his military force, abandoning behind vast amounts of armaments, provisions, and shattered aspirations of northern dominion. The remains of his most excellent warriors covered the fields surrounding Carchemish, stark evidence to the cost of undervaluing Babylon's fresh generation of leaders. Information of the triumph spread more rapidly than wind itself. Assyrian opposition collapsed instantly as surviving leaders comprehended they now confronted an unstoppable new power. Metropolitan states that had remained cautiously impartial rushed to transmit tribute and commitments of devotion. The authority balance in the classical world had transformed permanently. But for Nebuchadnezzar, personal triumph combined jarringly with abrupt, crushing responsibility. A single courier arrived from Babylon carrying news that ripped the world from beneath his feet. His father had perished. Overcome by sickness while his offspring achieved magnificence on remote battlefields, the successor prince was now the sovereign, whether he felt prepared or not. The triumph at Carchemish became legendary almost instantaneously. Singers performed stirring songs of the young sovereign who had humbled Egypt and inherited a dominion in a single fateful day. But Nebuchadnezzar understood the authentic, grueling work was merely commencing. Achieving a crown was simpler than preserving it. Constructing a dominion was infinitely more difficult than conquering one. The abrupt coronation. The royal courier reached Nebuchadnezzar's encampment while triumph festivities still resonated across the battlefield. Warriors sang surrounding their blazes, recounting instances of magnificence and narrow survivals. Seized Egyptian precious metal glittered fiercely in the flame light as commanders divided spoils according to classical tradition. Nobody anticipated the dispatch that would transform celebration into grim, frantic movement. Nabopolassar had perished. The sovereign who had shattered Assyrian authority and established a fresh dynasty had surrendered to illness while his offspring battled Egypt's most excellent. The communication bore the unmistakable royal marking and the signatures of high sacred ministers who verified the sovereign's passing. There could be no uncertainty, no possible postponement, no time for formal mourning. Nebuchadnezzar examined the document twice, his expression revealing nothing to the observing commanders. Internally, sentiments battled like opposing military forces. The profound, raw sorrow for a beloved paternal death. The sudden, chilling apprehension at the unimaginable responsibility now descending on his shoulders. Fury at destiny's cruel coordination which prevented him the opportunity to share the great triumph with the individual who had enabled it possible. But sovereignty permitted no duration for such sentiments. Already competitors would be advancing in Babylon. Governmental factions would be assessing their opportunities with a fresh, untested governor. Regional administrators would be evaluating the dangers of rebellion. The dominion's steadiness balanced by threads that could fracture at any instant. The fresh sovereign acted with the instant rapidity that would characterize his complete governance. Directives flew from his encampment like projectiles from a bow. The military force would proceed for Babylon instantaneously, abandoning only minimal forces to maintain captured territory. Personal wealth would be distributed widely to purchase devotion. Couriers would race forward with information of the sovereign's immediate return. By midnight, the complete Babylonian force was advancing rapidly southward. They traveled lightly, forsaking substantial equipment and slow advancing baggage convoys. What signified now was sheer rapidity, not luxury. The crown awaited nobody, and neither would its fresh claimant. The progression became a desperate competition against conspiracy and disorder. Each distance covered brought them nearer to the protection of the capital, but likewise nearer to whatever schemes might be developing in the capital itself. Nebuchadnezzar rode hard with his personal protection, exchanging horses regularly, halting only when the creatures collapsed from depletion. Accounts reached them along the pathway, some uplifting, some troubling. The royal assembly had proclaimed Nebuchadnezzar sovereign and directed preparations for his immediate coronation. But murmurs mentioned covert gatherings and private military forces assembling in aristocratic properties. The fresh sovereign would confront challenges before he even reached the throne chamber. They covered the distance to Babylon in unprecedented time, their arrival catching potential adversaries completely unprepared. The metropolis gateways parted at the sight of the familiar royal standards. But Nebuchadnezzar noticed how many armed individuals lined the fortifications. Devotion had boundaries even in the capital. The coronation occurred within days of his arrival, rushed and grimly necessary. The high priests, robed in ancient linen and gold, meticulously executed the classical rituals passed down through millennia, their chants filling the vast, silent throne chamber. Aristocrats and governors pressed forward, a crush of embroidered silks and polished bronze, each man offering studied expressions and pledging solemn, measured commitments of allegiance to the new order. But the fresh sovereign observed their faces with unwavering, calculating eyes, interpreting the true measure of their loyalty and the unspoken assessments hidden behind their ceremonial facades. Marduk's towering golden representation seemed to lean down, blessing the heavy crown as its cold metal contacted the newly shorn hair of Nebuchadnezzar. The weight of the circlet felt far more substantial than any combat protection he had ever worn, compressing downward with the accumulated, terrifying authority of countless generations. Every sovereign who had worn this symbol was now deceased, their vast identities etched in enduring masonry or utterly forgotten by the sands of time. Soon enough, his own name would join that solemn roster of recognition and mortality. But not quickly, not while the fierce power of the gods flowed in his circulation, and while fierce adversaries waited impatiently just beyond the frontiers of his empire. The crown had chosen him, or perhaps, with audacious confidence, he had chosen it. Regardless, the connection was sealed. A pact forged in precious metal and sacred oil, witnessed simultaneously by divine beings and the nervous gathering of mortals alike. The fresh sovereign's initial royal proclamation stunned everyone into bewildered silence. Instead of ordering the swift elimination of potential dynastic competitors or lavishly compensating his inner circle of political supporters, he announced ambitious, colossal construction initiatives that would immediately employ thousands upon thousands of laborers. Instead of elevating levies and draining the people's meager funds to fill royal reserves, he boldly opened the sealed treasuries to finance massive public works projects. The communication was unmistakable and potent. This new governance would not be defined by the smoke of destruction, but by the clean lines of creation, characterized by expansion, not devastation. Some observers whispered that this demonstrated profound wisdom. Others, far more cynical, suspected a hidden vulnerability or a sign of naivete. Nebuchadnezzar himself understood it was pure, cold political assessment. Nothing purchased and secured devotion quite like consistent, well-paid employment and the satisfaction of full appetites. Nothing prevented the festering rot of rebellion like genuine optimism for a superior tomorrow. The crown belonged to him now, but the act of preserving it would demand every single ability he had absorbed and honed in a lifetime of ruthless readiness. Babylon reborn. The constructor sovereign, the fresh sovereign, positioned himself upon the high roof of the governmental complex at the first stroke of dawn, gazing out over his vast capital as the morning illumination transformed the drab mud brick into something resembling precious metal. Babylon was already spectacular, an impressive wonder of the ancient world, but Nebuchadnezzar perceived untapped possibilities that others overlooked entirely. Where they perceived completion, he envisioned fundamental transformation. Where they perceived mere fortifications, he aspired to manifest genuine, legendary wonders. His chief designers spread their complex plans across vast marble surfaces, their illustrations depicting a metropolis that would not just impress, but would genuinely astound all of civilization. The Ishtar Gateway would be majestically reconstructed in brilliant azure tile that appeared to capture and hold the very atmosphere itself. The ceremonial pathway would be lined with monstrous, proud lions that seemed poised and ready to spring from the fortifications. Suspended gardens would cascade down stepped levels, a vibrant defiance of all natural regulations, creating an impossible mountain of greenery. Precious metal flowed into these immense initiatives like the rivers during the inundation season. Tribute from conquered territories, immense commercial profits from the merchant caravans, and sacred treasures willingly provided by ministers who perceived a clear divine blessing in the royal aspiration. The sovereign dedicated the wealth as rapidly as it arrived, pouring astronomical fortunes into masonry, tile, and gold. Laborers arrived from every remote territory of the Dominion. Master craftspeople from metropolitan areas that had previously been adversaries, accomplished laborers who had constructed sacred buildings and governmental complexes for foreign governors, creative individuals whose immense talents had once decorated adversary halls. Now, all of them assisted in building Babylon's ultimate perspective of itself. The sovereign traversed among them continuously, silently examining their approaches, endorsing their creations with a nod, compelling them to surpass their own highest anticipations. He comprehended something that numerous previous governors overlooked. Magnificent structures demanded far more than just precious metal. They required passion, a unified perspective, and the type of personal guidance that motivated ordinary individuals to generate extraordinary, lasting achievements. The Hanging Gardens became his greatest masterwork and, simultaneously, his greatest enigma. Some claimed they were constructed for a nostalgic queen who longed for the verdant elevations of her native territory. Others asserted they represented the sovereign's audacious attempt to generate paradise on earth for mortals. The truth was simpler, yet profoundly more intricate. They existed because Nebuchadnezzar fundamentally believed that impossible achievements should be rendered real by the sheer force of human will. Water flowed upward through complex, concealed channels, nourishing imported plants that had no rational justification for surviving in the harsh desert atmosphere. Trees from remote mountains grew successfully beside flowers from distant, fertile valleys. The atmosphere itself appeared different within the gardens, cool and pleasantly moist, touched with fragrances that belonged to no single recognizable location. Observers arrived from across the recognized world to witness what mortal craftsmanship had miraculously achieved. They ascended the garden's stepped levels in utter amazement, contacting leaves and flowers that pure human reasoning claimed could not possibly exist in that arid land. Some wept openly at the sheer magnificence. Others fell into profound silence, overwhelmed by the tangible evidence that mortals could, in fact, generate glimpses of paradise. But the gardens were only a portion of a much larger, unifying perspective. The complete metropolis ascended around them like a jewel in an elaborate configuration. Thoroughfares were widened and straightened, meticulously designed for efficiency. Public areas gained cooling fountains and comforting shade vegetation. Trading centers expanded to accommodate merchants from territories whose very identities were barely recognized in Babylon. The Tower of Babel grew steadily taller under Nebuchadnezzar's determined governance, its ziggurat steps transporting the faithful nearer to their divine beings. Each tier was painted in elaborate pigments that recounted the chronicle of creation itself. At its summit, ministers executed profound rituals that connected earth to atmosphere, mortal to divine, the present moment to the eternal future. Yet for all his construction fervor, the sovereign never disregarded the stark truth that magnificence demanded protection. The metropolis fortifications ascended ever higher and more substantial, their vast surfaces decorated with intricate scenes of triumph and subjugation. Protection structures provided clear, distant perspectives across the miles of surrounding desert. Armament districts stored enough weaponry to equip scores of military forces. Babylon became a sweeping declaration inscribed in masonry and precious metal, announcing to the entire world that mortal aspiration recognized no boundaries when guided by perspective and supported by absolute authority. Traders mentioned its splendor in remote trading centers. Warriors transported its fame to foreign encampments. Young ones in distant settlements absorbed its identity, whispering its name as a synonym for wonder itself. The sovereign traversed his transformed metropolis each evening, observing the sunset paint his creations in shades of blaze and cooling darkness. This colossal city was his inheritance, more enduring than any fleeting military triumphs, more significant than any conquered territories. Long after his physical remains transformed to dust, these massive fortifications would stand as undeniable evidence to what one individual's fierce aspiration could accomplish. But even as he constructed toward eternity, more sinister forces flowed restlessly beneath the surface of his consciousness. Visions plagued his rest, prophecies that mentioned kingdoms ascending and descending like relentless waves against the coastline. A young Hebrew oracle traversed his halls, uttering unnerving words that indicated even the mightiest human structures must ultimately collapse into ruin. The sovereign aggressively pushed such terrifying contemplations aside, concentrating instead on the tangible, immediate reality of masonry, tile, and precious metal. Yet occasionally, in a quiet, isolated instance, he questioned what terrible cost the divine beings might ultimately demand for permitting mortals to construct so proximate to paradise. Nebuchadnezzar and the Hebrew displacement. Jerusalem finally collapsed on a hot summer dawn when the fortifications fractured irrevocably under the overwhelming Babylonian force. The siege had endured for months, a relentless grind that reduced the sacred metropolis to dust and utter desperation. Now, battle-hardened warriors flooded through shattered gateways, while thick smoke ascended from burning structures. This was merely another great triumph for Babylon's rapidly expanding dominion, but a complete catastrophe for the population caught in its devastating pathway. Nebuchadnezzar entered the conquered metropolis on foot, traversing the thoroughfares that his siege devices had reduced to rubble. Solomon's sacred building drew his concentration instantaneously. Even damaged, it radiated a type of profound sacred presence that made pragmatic, ruthless individuals pause and contemplate possibilities beyond the material realm. The sovereign examined the temple's construction with a designer's perception. Cedar timbers imported from Lebanon, bronze craftsmanship that competed fiercely with anything in Babylon, and precious metal leaf that captured illumination like imprisoned sunshine. These Hebrews might be obstinate and rebellious, but they constructed with a sophisticated ability that demanded grudging respect. Inside the sacred building, ministers and aristocrats gathered under guard, their destiny chillingly uncertain. Among them positioned individuals whose demeanor indicated exceptional education and mental capacity. These were not common captives to be distributed in bondage trading centers. These were sharp consciousnesses that might significantly assist Babylon's strategic objectives if properly influenced and managed. The Hebrew leaders observed their conqueror with a combined mixture of apprehension and stubborn resistance. They had received chronicles of his triumphs, his monumental construction initiatives, and his standing for both calculated brutality and political cunning. Some anticipated immediate termination and destruction. Others optimized for a surprising compassion that might preserve their population's fragile future. Nebuchadnezzar surprised them completely. Instead of directing mass terminations or sacred building devastation, he instructed his warriors to assemble specific, valuable treasures. Sacred containers would proceed to Babylon's sacred buildings, but the structure itself would remain largely intact. This was subjugation with a clear, strategic objective, not simple, pointless devastation. The deportation commenced within days. Not everyone would proceed into displacement, but the very finest of Hebrew civilization would travel eastward to enhance Babylonian culture. Academics and administrators, skilled craftspeople and innovative traders, young aristocrats with capacity for royal assistance. The most excellent consciousnesses and accomplished hands would now serve their fresh sovereign. Among the displaced was a young individual named Daniel, whose mental capacity and composed demeanor caught the royal concentration instantaneously. He navigated through the disorder of departure with a profound composure that indicated either exceptional bravery or deep, unwavering conviction, perhaps both in equal measure. The sovereign filed the observation away for future contemplation. The passage to Babylon extended across weeks of exhausting desert travel. The displaced traversed in organized assemblies, protected by guards but not physically restrained. Their captors comprehended that healthy, skilled servants were substantially more valuable than shattered, exhausted ones. Water and sustenance were supplied consistently. Rest intervals permitted recovery from the progression's demands. Along the pathway, Nebuchadnezzar occasionally rode among the captives, observing their conduct, absorbing fragments of their discussions. These Hebrews possessed something he found profoundly fascinating. They maintained respectability in downfall, optimism in displacement, and conviction in circumstances that would have utterly crushed lesser populations. Their invisible divine being captivated him most completely, not a physical representation that could be seized or obliterated, but an invisible presence they asserted governed all territories and all sovereigns. Their own oracles had genuinely predicted Babylon's triumph, asserting that their divine being utilized foreign military forces to discipline Hebrew disobedience. It was a theology that miraculously transformed catastrophic downfall into necessary discipline, displacement into an unexpected education. In Babylon, the Hebrew displaced were positioned in their own district near the substantial channel. They were allowed to execute their faith, preserve their traditions, and even flourish if they selected cooperation over opposition. Numerous individuals did select cooperation, bringing abilities and understanding that significantly enhanced their adoptive homeland. Daniel and several associates were selected for special, high-level education in Babylonian language, literature, and hall protocol. The sovereign desired to examine whether Hebrew wisdom could competently complement established Babylonian instruction. The experiment would demonstrate far more fascinating and consequential than anyone anticipated. The displacement generated unexpected advantages for both cultures. Hebrews absorbed Babylonian astronomy, mathematics, and complex governmental approaches. Babylonians encountered Hebrew concepts of law, principles, and the radical notion of monotheism. The combining produced fresh concepts that neither culture could have developed independently. But tension remained palpable beneath the surface. The Hebrews were displaced people, not voluntary immigrants. They preserved an intense, burning optimism of eventual restoration to their homeland. Their psalms mention Zion with a yearning that duration and distance could not diminish. They suspended their musical instruments on willows and wept bitterly when they recalled Jerusalem. Nebuchadnezzar observed these complex dynamics with the clinical interest of a natural politician. Displacement could generate violent rebellion if handled inadequately, but it might likewise generate fierce devotion if managed with profound wisdom. The Hebrews' destiny would depend largely on how successfully they adapted to their fresh circumstances and how beneficial they demonstrated themselves to be for burgeoning Babylonian interests. The foundation was now established for remarkable encounters between sovereign and oracle, between overwhelming earthly authority and compelling divine vocation, between the pride of dominion and the quiet humility of profound conviction. Daniel and the Hall of the Sovereign. The young Hebrew positioned himself before the Babylonian hall administrators with a composure that dramatically contradicted his youthful years. Daniel, offspring of Judah's aristocracy, had been selected for a recognition that numerous would have labeled a condemnation: education within the conqueror's governmental complex. He would absorb the intricate language of his captors, examine their complex literature, and adopt their court traditions. In 3 short years, he would emerge as a polished servant of the crown that had brutally obliterated his homeland. The hall official explained the training program with bureaucratic proficiency. The young individuals would receive the most excellent, luxurious education Babylon could supply. They would consume rich, ceremonial sustenance from the royal surface, absorb the sovereign's fine wine, and learn from masters who had instructed generations of princes and administrators. They would become vital connections between Hebrew wisdom and Babylonian authority. Daniel absorbed the details with careful concentration, but his response surprised everyone present. He would accept the education gratefully, but he requested immediate authorization to preserve his specific dietary regulations. No meat from the royal surface, no wine from the sovereign's containers, only vegetables and water, consumed according to the sacred traditions of his population. The request appeared utterly foolish to the Babylonian perception. Here was a mere captive requesting special accommodation based on faith scruples that his conquerors neither comprehended nor respected. The official worried intensely that such a regimen would leave the young individuals weak and sickly, reflecting poorly on his management of the program. But Daniel proposed an examination. For 10 days, permit him and his associates to consume only vegetables and absorb only water while alternative students enjoyed the rich sustenance and strong wine. Then, compare their appearance and vitality. If the simple regimen demonstrated inadequate, they would willingly accept whatever sustenance was supplied. The experiment commenced with skeptical witnesses anticipating rapid failure. Hall physicians predicted that the Hebrew youths would shortly display undeniable indications of malnutrition. Kitchen personnel wagered openly on how rapidly the boys would forsake their principles when hunger truly struck. Even friendly administrators worried that Daniel's obstinacy would permanently damage promising careers. Instead, something completely unexpected occurred. The Hebrew students appeared consistently healthier and stronger than their classmates who consumed from the royal surface. Their complexion glowed with vitality. Their eyes remained bright and vigilant during extended study sessions. Their consciousness appeared sharper, more concentrated, than those of students who enjoyed richer provisions. Word of the phenomenon reached King Nebuchadnezzar's perception, sparking his profound curiosity about these unusual captives. He had conquered numerous populations, but few had preserved their principles so consistently under duress. Most displaced populations either shattered entirely under captivity's burden or sank into bitter, feudal opposition. These Hebrews had discovered a third pathway that deeply fascinated him. Daniel's standing grew rapidly as his education advanced. He mastered Babylonian language more quickly than anticipated, displaying particular aptitude for the intricate cuneiform inscription system. His comprehension of mathematics, astronomy, and literature impressed instructors who had educated generations of hall administrators. But most remarkable was his apparent capacity to comprehend visions and prophecies, accessing knowledge beyond mortal study. The sovereign commenced summoning Daniel to the hall for private consultations, not merely as an entertainer or a strange curiosity, but as a valued consultant whose insights demonstrated surprisingly valuable. Daniel's divine being appeared to grant him a comprehension that purely mortal wisdom could not accomplish. His guidance carried influence that dramatically transcended his youth and foreign origins. Alternative Hebrew displaced individuals observed Daniel's ascent with a combined sense of pride and apprehension. Pride because one of their own had accomplished influence in the conqueror's hall. Apprehension because achievement in Babylon might signify a compromise with Babylon's pagan principles. They murmured questions about whether assisting earthly authority could coexist faithfully with assisting the divine being of paradise. Daniel himself navigated these intense tensions with careful equilibrium. He assisted the sovereign faithfully in all affairs that did not directly violate divine directives. He provided honest guidance even when it contained unwelcome, politically dangerous truths. He preserved Hebrew sacred practices while adapting intelligently to Babylonian court traditions. It was a precarious pathway that demanded constant, spiritual vigilance. The relationship between sovereign and oracle developed slowly, constructed on mutual respect rather than mere political expedience. Nebuchadnezzar appreciated Daniel's unyielding integrity, his refusal to communicate to powerful individuals only what they desired to absorb. Daniel perceived past the sovereign's overwhelming earthly magnificence, to recognize a soul capable of both staggering greatness and terrible foolishness. Their discussions ranged across subjects both pragmatic and profound: military planning and divine judgment, construction initiatives and eternal kingdoms, the intrinsic nature of authority, and the ultimate boundaries of mortal aspiration. Each individual challenged the other's fundamental assumptions while absorbing from perspectives that would have been utterly impossible in their separate realms. But the genuine examination of their relationship rested ahead, hidden in visions that would shake the very foundations of earthly authority and revelations that would permanently transform how both individuals comprehended the interaction between mortal will and divine objective. The forgotten vision. The sovereign woke violently in the darkness, his core pounding like conflict drums in his torso. Perspiration soaked his body despite the cool night atmosphere flowing through the governmental complex apertures. Something vast, terrible, and profoundly significant had visited his rest. But when he reached desperately for the recollection, it slipped away like liquid through his grasp. He remained motionless, desperately attempting to recapture fragments of the prophecy. Images flickered at the edge of consciousness. Something impossibly tall and blindingly illuminating. Pigments that shifted like the dusk. Sounds that shook the earth itself. But the more forcefully he grasped for specific details, the more they faded into mist and total darkness. By morning, only the sensation remained. A sense of profound, overwhelming significance, as if the vision had contained understanding that could completely reshape kingdoms. But the understanding itself was gone, leaving behind only the certainty that it had been vital, potentially more vital than any communication he had ever received. The sovereign summoned his wise individuals instantaneously. Babylon's most educated academics assembled nervously in the throne chamber, their expressions expectant. They had interpreted royal visions before, explaining the significance of prophecies that troubled their master's rest. This should be routine work for individuals of their preparation and experience. But Nebuchadnezzar's demand stunned them into immediate, fearful silence. He would not communicate the vision's substance. Instead, they must communicate to him what he had experienced and then explain its significance. If they possessed genuine, esoteric wisdom, surely they could reveal secrets that had been concealed even from the visionary himself. The hall astrologers protested vehemently that nobody could be anticipated to understand another individual's private visions. They required details to work with, images to interpret, symbols to decode. Without the basic facts, how could they provide any analysis whatsoever? The sovereign's response chilled every individual present to the bone. If they could not reveal both the vision and its significance, they would all perish. Not displacement or imprisonment, but absolute termination, and their families would share their destiny. The wise individuals of Babylon had until sunrise to demonstrate their immense wisdom or confront the irreversible consequences of their failure. Panic extended through the academic community like wildfire. Individuals who had consulted sovereigns and guided dominions discovered themselves utterly helpless before an impossible demand. They consulted their volumes and charts, executed rituals and sacrifices, but the vision remained concealed from their comprehension. Information reached Daniel through his connections in the Hebrew displacement community. The young individual who had gained the sovereign's respect now confronted the same death sentence as Babylon's native academics. Unless someone could penetrate the impossible enigma, Dawn would bring mass terminations that would devastate the kingdom's intellectual guidance. Daniel's response surprised his frightened associates. Instead of despair or fury, he displayed calm, resolute determination. He requested his friends to appeal with him, pursuing divine revelation for what mortal wisdom could not achieve. Through the long night, they appealed intensely to the divine being of paradise for compassion and comprehension. The revelation arrived before dawn, complete and evident as daylight itself. Daniel perceived not only the vision's exact substance, but its profound significance, its chilling implications for kingdoms yet unborn. He comprehended precisely why the prophecy had both arrived to the sovereign and been simultaneously concealed from him. Some understanding demanded divine interpretation to be properly comprehended. As the initial illumination contacted Babylon's towering structures, Daniel requested an immediate audience with the sovereign. The protectors who admitted him anticipated escorting another failure to his termination. Instead, they witnessed something that would become legendary in governmental complex corridors for generations approaching. Daniel positioned himself before the throne with quiet confidence, neither boastful nor visibly apprehensive. He acknowledged that no mortal wisdom could reveal what the sovereign demanded. But the divine being of paradise, who understood all secrets, had selected to render this enigma fully understood. What followed would demonstrate the raw power of divine authority working through mortal comprehension. The vision had displayed a magnificent statue, brilliant and terrible to observe. Its head was pure, gleaming precious metal gold. Its torso and arms were silver. Its abdomen and thighs were bronze. Its legs were iron. Its feet were a fragile mixture of iron and clay. As the sovereign observed, a stone cut without human hands struck the statue's feet and instantly shattered the complete structure. The stone then grew rapidly into a mountain that filled the whole earth. Nebuchadnezzar's expression confirmed every single detail. This was genuinely the prophecy that had plagued his rest and then mysteriously vanished with the dawn. But comprehending its full significance demanded interpretation that surpassed mere recollection. Daniel explained that the statue represented kingdoms that would majestically ascend and violently collapse across the span of history. The precious metal head was Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar's governance, the greatest dominion the world had yet witnessed. But alternative kingdoms would certainly follow, each strong in its own manner, but intrinsically inferior to what had arrived before. The silver torso represented the subsequent dominion, strong in wealth but not as magnificent as gold. The bronze abdomen mentioned a third kingdom that would govern widely over all the earth. The iron legs described a fourth dominion, strong and unbreakable as iron, but ultimately divided against itself. The fragile feet, iron mixed with common clay, symbolized the final state, a kingdom perpetually weakened by internal fracturing and instability. The feet, composed of iron inextricably mixed with brittle clay, were the weak point, revealing a foundational vulnerability that would render the ultimate kingdom susceptible to internal decay and final obliteration. But the stone, carved without the touch of mortal hands, a supernatural agent, signified something entirely different. Not a mortal empire constructed through brutal subjugation, political maneuvering, and ceaseless bloodshed, but a divine and eternal kingdom established by celestial forces themselves. This coming dominion would utterly pulverize and consume all earthly authorities, the gold, silver, bronze, and iron, and persist eternally, never transferring its power to alternative populations or succumbing to another conqueror. The sheer majesty of this interpretation left the sovereign utterly wordless, stripped of his usual bombast. Here was a prophecy not just of the future, but of history itself, mapping out his position in the magnificent, terrifying sweep of time, while cautioning that even his precious metal dominion, the zenith of human glory, would ultimately pass away. Magnificence was transitory. Authority was temporary. Only the kingdom of paradise would demonstrate true permanence. Yet, the vision likewise confirmed Babylon's glorious present supremacy. Nebuchadnezzar constituted the head of precious metal, the golden benchmark against which all subsequent kingdoms would be evaluated. His governance signified the summit of mortal dominion, the instant when earthly authority contacted its greatest and most dazzling manifestation. The sovereign's response revealed the intricate, oscillating nature of his character. He immediately honored Daniel with lavish gifts and a high administrative position, acknowledging that divine wisdom had accomplished what the best mortal instruction, all the Babylonian astrologers and enchanters, could not. But he likewise absorbed the vision's implications for his own governance and legacy. From that day forward, the relationship between sovereign and oracle assumed fresh and dangerous dimensions. Daniel had demonstrated himself capable of accessing understanding far beyond ordinary human comprehension. Nebuchadnezzar had discovered that his kingdom, however magnificent, constituted merely a small portion of a colossal cosmic configuration that extended toward objectives he could barely grasp. The forgotten vision became the foundational cornerstone for everything that followed. It established Daniel's unassailable credibility and revealed Paradise's active, vested interest in earthly matters. It displayed to the sovereign both his incredible greatness and his ultimate sobering boundaries. Most significantly, it introduced themes of divine sovereignty versus mortal pride that would resonate and escalate through the remaining decades of Nebuchadnezzar's governance. The statue stood complete in the sovereign's recollection now, brilliant and terrible, extending toward paradise, but destined to collapse when the appointed, inevitable instant arrived. The precious metal representation and the furnace. The vision of the magnificent statue became a persistent affliction to Nebuchadnezzar's peace. Night after night, he perceived that towering figure of precious metal, silver, bronze, and iron. Daniel had labeled him the head of precious metal, the greatest of all kingdoms, but also destined to fall. Visions, however, fade, and human pride intensifies, proving far stronger than recollection. On the flat lands of Dura, laborers toiled incessantly beneath the scorching Mesopotamian sun. They molded clay and poured rivers of molten metal. Hammers rang out against anvils in a deafening, rhythmic display of power. The sovereign had directed the construction of something spectacular, something that would exceed every sacred building, every statue, every monument ever constructed on the face of the earth. A precious metal image 90 feet tall, 9 feet wide, molded entirely of pure, glittering gold. It captured sunlight like an imprisoned sun, radiating defiant brilliance across the plain. The craftspeople worked in grueling rotations, driven by the king's impatience. Babylonian precious metal flowed like thick, molten honey into waiting molds. The image assumed form slowly, a figure both magnificent in its cost and terrible in its intent. Some murmured it resembled the sovereign himself, capturing his regal bearing. Others claimed it mirrored Marduk, the powerful patron divine being of Babylon. But everyone understood the deeper, unspoken truth. This precious metal giant was a monument to the king's refusal to submit to any divine being but himself, a physical, golden rejection of Daniel's prophecy of mixed metals and eventual collapse. Invitations, written on clay and papyrus, were distributed across the entire dominion. Every administrator, every satrap, every magistrate, and every treasurer must arrive. The dedication ceremony would be magnificent beyond calculation, a display of unparalleled imperial power. Music would saturate the atmosphere, filling the air with sound. Harps and pipes and horns would sound together in a carefully orchestrated, overwhelming symphony. When that music performed, everyone, without exception, must prostrate and revere the precious metal image. This was not a request. This was an absolute, non-negotiable directive. The day arrived, the morning mist still adhering to the vast flat lands. Thousands assembled, administrators from every remote territory of the dominion. Persians with their flowing, colorful garments, Medes with their distinctive pointed caps, and Babylonians in their most excellent silk robes. The precious metal statue towered above them all, gleaming like a second sun, radiating heat and authority. Nebuchadnezzar positioned himself on his raised platform, surveying the immense gathering. His voice, amplified by the natural acoustics of the plain and sheer authority, traveled across the flat land when he communicated. Population of all territories and languages, he announced. his voice ringing with power. When you perceive the music, you will prostrate and revere the precious metal image. Anyone who refuses will be hurled instantaneously into a blazing furnace, already prepared. The musicians raised their instruments. Harps sang pleasantly, pipes trilled like birds, and massive horns boomed like rolling thunder. The coordinated music swelled and resonated across the flat land. As one, the vast, intimidated gathering prostrated to the ground. Expressions pressed against the dust. Arms extended wide in feigned or genuine reverence. The sight pleased the sovereign greatly. But wait, 3 figures remained conspicuously standing. 3 individuals in simple, unremarkable Hebrew garments. Their expressions were calm but utterly determined. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They were the companions of Daniel, the associates who shared his displacement and exile from Jerusalem. They stood like immovable trees in a windstorm, untouched by the music, unmoved by apprehension, defying the colossal weight of imperial power surrounding them. Murmurs rippled through the prostrate gathering. Some administrators, ever eager to curry favor, perceived their opportunity. They crawled forward and approached the sovereign with eager, malicious expressions. "Your Majesty," they communicated, their voices laced with false indignation. "These Jews, whom you appointed over the province of Babylon, refuse to revere your precious metal image. They disregard your directive. They display no respect for your divine beings." Nebuchadnezzar's expression darkened like storm clouds assembling over the plains. Fury, hot and sudden, built like a contained explosion in his torso. These were individuals he trusted, individuals he himself positioned in high stations. Their resistance cut deeper than simple rebellion from strangers. He summoned for the 3 Hebrews to be brought before him, his face contorted. "Is this accurate?" His voice trembled with barely contained fury. "Do you refuse to revere my divine beings and submit to my precious metal image? I'll grant you one more opportunity. When the music performs again, prostrate and revere. If you refuse, you'll proceed straight into the blazing furnace. And what divine being," he sneered, "will rescue you from my grasp?" Shadrach stepped forward. His voice remained steady, remarkably steady, almost gentle amidst the chaos. "King Nebuchadnezzar, we don't require defending ourselves concerning this matter. If we are hurled into the blazing furnace, the divine being we assist can rescue us. He is powerful enough to deliver us from the flames and from your hand, your Majesty. But even if he chooses not to," Shadrach concluded the ultimate act of faith, "we desire you to understand clearly that we will not assist your divine beings or revere the precious metal image you have erected." The sovereign's fury exploded like lightning-shattering stone. His expression twisted into a mask of pure rage. "Heat the furnace 7 times hotter than usual," he shouted, his command echoing over the silent crowd. His strongest, most massive warriors bound the 3 individuals tightly with heavy ropes. The Hebrews did not struggle or plead. Their expressions remained peaceful, almost serene, even as they were dragged toward the roaring heat. The massive furnace roared like a hungry, predatory creature. Flames leaped and danced, extending maniacally toward the atmosphere. The heat waves shimmered and blurred the atmosphere around the structure. Even from a distance, the warmth stung exposed skin. The elite warriors approached with their captives, but the heat drove them backward, searing their flesh. They tied longer ropes, attempting desperately to get close enough to hurl the Hebrews in. Finally, the strongest protectors managed to hurl the 3 individuals into the heart of the flames. But something proceeded terribly, instantaneously wrong. The blaze's heat was so incredibly intense, 7 times normal, that the powerful warriors themselves were instantly consumed by the searing thermal blast. They collapsed dead at the furnace mouth, their task completed at the immediate cost of their existences. Inside the furnace, something impossible occurred. Nebuchadnezzar leaned forward, shading his eyes against the blinding glare. He blinked hard, then observed again, his breath catching in his throat. "Weren't 3 individuals hurled into the blaze?" he asked his consultants, whispering the question. "Yes, your Majesty," they replied, equally stunned. Bound with ropes, but I perceive 4 individuals traversing around in the blaze, the sovereign whispered, his voice thick with awe. They're unbound and completely unharmed. And the fourth appears like a son of the divine beings. The sovereign approached as close as the blistering heat would permit, compelled by disbelief. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High Divine Being, emerge. His voice transported both directive and profound wonder. The 3 individuals calmly emerged from the flames. Their hair displayed no indication of burning. Their garments remained untouched by the blaze. Not even the faintest smell of smoke adhered to them. The assembled administrators pressed close, contacting their garments, examining their skin. Nothing. No burn marks, no singed hair, no evidence they had ever entered the furnace. Nebuchadnezzar stared at them in utter amazement. Something shifted inside his core. The rage drained away, replaced by overwhelming awe and deep apprehension. Praise be to the divine being of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, he declared, his voice booming across the stunned gathering. He transmitted his angel and rescued his servants. They trusted in him and defied my directive. They were willing to surrender their existences rather than assist any divine being except their own. A directive was distributed that very day, signed by the king himself. Anyone who spoke a word against the divine being of the Hebrews would be cut to pieces and their residences obliterated, reduced to rubble. No alternative divine being can preserve like this, the sovereign proclaimed. The 3 individuals received immediate, massive promotions in the province of Babylon. But late that night, alone in his opulent chamber, Nebuchadnezzar paced and contemplated. He had constructed a precious metal image to display his absolute authority. Instead, he had witnessed a transcendent authority beyond his comprehension. The 4th figure in the flames plagued his recollection. Who was that being who traversed unharmed through a blaze hot enough to instantly terminate his strongest warriors? The precious metal statue still stood on the flat lands of Dura. But something had fundamentally transformed. The sovereign who demanded reverence had perceived genuine divinity. The governor who threatened mortality had observed existence triumph over flame. Foundations of humility commenced to sprout, unseen, in the soil of his entrenched pride, though he didn't recognize them yet. Babylon at zenith. The dominion extended like a golden dawn across the classical world. From the snow-covered mountains of Armenia in the north to the scorching deserts of Arabia in the south, Nebuchadnezzar's word constituted absolute regulation. Commercial routes transported endless treasure from every territory of the known earth. Silk arrived from remote territories, spices that heavily perfumed the atmosphere, and precious metal that flowed like water through Babylon's bustling trading centers. The metropolis itself had become a wonder beyond human conception. The Ishtar Gateway ascended like a jeweled, majestic crown, its azure tiles gleaming with detailed dragons and bulls crafted meticulously in precious metal and silver. Observers passed through its mighty arch and gasped at the sight beyond. Thoroughfares paved with polished stones extended toward the horizon. Suspended gardens cascaded luxuriantly from stepped fortifications, their terraces appearing to defy gravity. Sacred buildings, including the towering ziggurat, pierced the atmosphere like massive fingers extending toward paradise. In the magnificent throne chamber, ambassadors waited in lengthy, humble formations. They arrived bearing extravagant gifts and tribute. Egyptian ministers provided sacred texts inscribed on fine papyrus. Persian aristocrats presented rare, muscular horses with coats like burnished copper. Phoenician traders displayed purple dye valued more than silver. Each pursued the sovereign's favor, hoping for the privilege of trading in his dominion. Nebuchadnezzar maintained court from morning until evening. His judgment settled complex disputes across continents. A single word from his lips could raise metropolitan areas to glory or reduce them to rubble. Administrators traveled for months just to perceive his directives and transport them back to remote provinces. The governmental complex sprawled like a metropolis within the metropolis. Hundreds of intricate chambers accommodated the royal family, the hall administrators, and thousands of servants. The sovereign's private chambers overflowed with unimaginable luxury. Cedar timber imported from Lebanon paneled the fortifications. Ivory inlays recounted detailed chronicles of classical heroes. Carpets woven with threads of precious metal covered floors of polished marble. But the genuine, beating core of Babylon resonated in its ziggurat, the magnificent structure called Etemenanke, the foundation of heaven and earth. 7 massive tiers ascended toward the clouds, each one smaller than the one below, disappearing into the atmospheric haze. Priests ascended the endless stairs, transporting offerings to Marduk, the sovereign of divine beings. From the highest platform, they could perceive the dominion extending to every visible horizon. Commerce flowed through Babylon like lifeblood through a giant's powerful body. Caravans arrived continuously, their camels loaded with goods from the edges of the world. The trading centers never rested. Traders haggled in a dozen languages simultaneously. Currency exchanges weighed silver and precious metal on delicate scales. The atmosphere saturated with the loud sounds of commerce. Creaking wheels, shouting vendors, the ring of hammer on anvil. The sovereign's administrators worked in relentless rotations to manage this vast apparatus. They documented every transaction, every shipment, every levy payment. Clay tablets piled high in specialized archive chambers. Administrators duplicated regulations and transmitted them to remote administrators. The dominion operated on information, and information flowed through Babylon like a magnificent, controlled waterway. In the royal workshops, craftspeople generated true marvels. They forged weaponry that never dulled, crafted jewelry that captured sunlight with impossible brilliance, and wove textiles softer than pure silk. The sovereign's treasure chambers overflowed with their creations. Precious metal plates stacked like fallen leaves. Precious stones filled containers like common pebbles. Silver cups and bowls crowded shelves from floor to ceiling. The military force that protected this immense wealth had grown beyond counting. Foot soldiers marched in perfect, intimidating formation through the metropolis thoroughfares. Mounted forces rode horses bred for velocity and striking power. Archers practiced continuously in the preparation grounds. Siege devices stood ready to reduce any rebellious metropolis to dust within hours. Yet, beneath the spectacular, shining surface, more sinister forces flowed. Hall intrigue wove through the governmental complex like choking smoke. Aristocrats schemed against each other, pursuing hidden personal benefit. The sovereign's favor could instantly elevate an individual to unimaginable riches or cast him into immediate imprisonment. Everyone observed everyone else, pursuing vulnerability, plotting advancement. The sovereign himself had transformed, subtly but dangerously. Absolute authority had intoxicated him like strong, heady wine. He mentioned less frequently of the Hebrew divine being who had so miraculously preserved the 3 individuals from his furnace. The instructions of that day faded like morning mist. Pride built within him like force in a sealed container, intensifying stronger with each passing season. His construction initiatives extended toward a kind of magnificent madness. Not content with the most magnificent metropolis in the world, he planned additions and improvements. More suspended gardens, higher fortifications, grander sacred buildings. The hanging gardens, if they genuinely existed, represented just one jewel in a crown of architectural wonders. Foreign sovereigns transmitted their offspring to Babylon as both hostages and students. These young princes absorbed Babylonian methods, assimilating the dominion's authority and culture. Some would restore home as devoted, loyal supporters. Others would transport Babylon's vast influence to territories not yet conquered. The sovereign's immense personal household accommodated females from every territory, each one representing a strategic political alliance, a treaty sealed in marriage. Their offspring matured, speaking multiple languages, citizens of a dominion that spanned continents. Royal bloodline now flowed in the circulation of dozens of tributary kingdoms. But achievement breeds profound complacency. The dominion's very magnitude rendered it unwieldy and cumbersome. Communications required months to travel from the capital to remote provinces. Rebellions could intensify and extend before information reached Babylon. The sovereign could not be everywhere simultaneously, though he occasionally appeared to disregard this truth. Faith tensions simmered beneath the surface. The Hebrew displaced preserved their conviction despite existing among representation worshippers. Alternative conquered populations clung stubbornly to their ancient divine beings while paying mandatory homage to Marduk. The dominion's unity depended entirely on military force and sustained prosperity, not genuine, heartfelt devotion. Still, for now, the precious era continued. Babylon stood as the greatest metropolis the world had ever witnessed. Its sovereign governed with absolute, unquestioned authority over millions of subjects. Wealth flowed in perpetual streams. Creative expression and instruction prospered. The dominion appeared as permanent as the celestial bodies themselves. At night, Nebuchadnezzar traversed alone on his governmental complex roof, gazing out over his vast domain. The metropolis extended below him like a carpet of glittering jewels. Torches flickered in apertures. The sound of distant music and laughter drifted upward. This was his creation, his inheritance, his masterwork inscribed in masonry and precious metal. He did not yet suspect that dominions, like individuals, could collapse under the weight of their own arrogance. Pride, like water, pursues its own level and perpetually flows downward when the dam ultimately fractures. Visions restore the tree that collapsed. Rest brought no peace to the sovereign of Babylon. In the depths of night, when even the governmental complex protectors nodded at their stations, new prophecies danced behind Nebuchadnezzar's closed eyes. This vision differed sharply from the initial one of the magnificent statue with its head of precious metal. This fresh prophecy pulsed with intense existence and growth, a terrifying blend of magnificence and terror intertwined. He perceived a tree, not just any tree, but a giant that exceeded all others in size and majesty. Its trunk ascended thick and straight as a sacred building column. Branches extended wide enough to shelter entire military forces. Leaves shimmered verdant and silver in a strange sunlight that appeared to originate from within the tree itself. The sight saturated him with immense wonder and a peculiar, chilling unease. The tree grew even as he observed, gaining height rapidly. Its crown pushed higher into the atmosphere until it appeared to contact the very dome of paradise. Birds of every type nested securely in its branches. Eagles with precious metal eyes, doves white as fresh snow, peacocks trailing rainbow feathers. Their songs generated harmony more magnificent than any mortal musician could produce. Beneath the tree's vast, cooling canopy, creatures assembled in peaceful multitude. Lions reclined beside lambs. Bears engaged placidly with their cubs, while deer absorbed refreshing drink from crystal streams. Elephants with massive ivory tusks stood next to gazelles, swift as the wind. Every creature discovered shelter and sustenance here. Fruit hung substantial on the branches. Figs and dates and varieties unknown to waking eyes. The tree supplied for all. Its fruit nourished the hungry. Its shade protected the weary traveler. Its sheer magnificence inspired wonder in every heart. Population journeyed from remote territories just to rest beneath its branches. They departed refreshed in body and spirit, transporting accounts of the magnificent tree to every territory of the earth. But then the prophecy shifted abruptly. A terrifying figure descended from paradise, a being both terrible and magnificent, an undeniable messenger. His voice boomed like thunder rolling across mountain peaks. "Cut down the tree," he directed with absolute authority. "Strip off its leaves and scatter its fruit. Permit the creatures to escape from under it and the birds from its branches." Laborers appeared instantly with axes sharp as razors. They swung with methodical, ruthless precision. Each blow transmitted shudders through the mighty trunk. Leaves fluttered down like tears. Fruit collapsed and rotted where it landed. The birds cried out in distress as they escaped to alternative, smaller trees. Creatures scattered in confusion and apprehension. The magnificent tree crashed to earth with a sound like the world fracturing. This collapse shook the ground for distances around. Where once stood majesty and life, now only a stump remained. Rough bark surrounded heartwood exposed brutally to sun and rain. The sight brought sorrow too profound for words, but the celestial being communicated again, completing the judgment. Nevertheless, leave the stump with its roots in the ground. Bind it securely with iron and bronze bands. Permit it to be drenched with dew from paradise. Permit it to graze with the creatures in the grass of the field. Permit its consciousness to be transformed from that of an individual to that of a creature. Permit 7 periods of duration pass over it. The vision shifted once more, sickeningly. The stump commenced to transform. Hair sprouted coarse and unnatural from its surface like thick grass. Fingernails grew lengthy and curved like bird claws. The remaining vestige of timber transformed into flesh that understood no mortal thought or respectability. It crawled on hands and knees, pursuing grass to consume, eyes vacant of reasoning or recollection. Nebuchadnezzar woke with a violent gasp, struggling to breathe. Perspiration covered his body despite the cool night atmosphere of his chamber. His heart pounded like frantic conflict drums in his torso. The vision adhered to his consciousness with terrible, inescapable clarity. Every detail burned bright as flame. The tree's universal magnificence, its sudden obliteration, the horrifying creature it became. Morning brought no relief. The sovereign, still deeply rattled, immediately summoned his wise individuals, enchanters, and astrologers. They arrived rapidly, garments still rumpled from hasty dressing. Rest vanished from their eyes when they perceived the raw terror etched into their sovereign's expression. "I have experienced a vision," he communicated to them. Unlike before, he recalled every instant perfectly. He described the tree in all its initial magnificence, its abrupt obliteration, the stump that became a creature. The wise individuals absorbed the tale with intensifying unease. They murmured among themselves, casting worried glances at their sovereign. But their answers demonstrated utterly worthless. They mentioned vague symbols and omens, trees representing kingdoms and seasons signifying years. Their words danced nervously around the truth without ever contacting it. They apprehended to communicate plainly, sensing that this vision brought immediate danger to someone very proximate to the throne. Finally, the sovereign summoned for Daniel. The Hebrew oracle arrived with measured steps, his expression calm but deeply thoughtful. He absorbed the vision without interruption. As the sovereign communicated, Daniel's expression grew troubled, the usual composure giving way to genuine distress. He remained silent for an extended duration after the recounting concluded, the silence in the chamber stretching tautly. "My lord," Daniel communicated softly, with obvious reluctance and sorrow. "I desire this vision concerned your adversaries instead of you." He paused, gathering his conviction. "The tree you perceived, so spectacular and tall, supplying shelter and sustenance for all. That tree is you, your majesty. Your greatness has intensified until it extends to the celestial bodies. Your governance extends to the ends of the earth." The sovereign leaned forward, demanding, knowing more terrifying words would arrive. Daniel continued with obvious reluctance. "The messenger from paradise who directed the tree cut down. His directive is against you. You will be driven away from population and exist with the wild creatures. You will consume grass like livestock and be drenched with dew from paradise. 7 periods of duration will pass until you acknowledge that the Most High governs over mortal kingdoms and grants them to whoever he desires." Silence saturated the throne chamber like thick fog. The sovereign's consultants dared not breathe too loudly. Daniel's words hung in the atmosphere, a death sentence pronounced by a prophet upon the mightiest king on earth, like a sword suspended by a single, fraying thread. But the Hebrew oracle was not yet complete. Daniel's voice softened, offering the narrow path of redemption. "The commandment to leave the tree stump rooted in the earth signifies that your royal dominion will be surely restored to you, but only after you have fully acknowledged that the heavens, that a greater, divine paradise, actually governs the fate of mankind. Therefore, your majesty, I implore you, accept my desperate counsel. Turn away from your manifold transgressions by immediately executing what is righteous and correct in the eyes of that great authority." Transform yourself from your innate wickedness by extending true compassion and radical mercy to those who are downtrodden and oppressed. Only then, perhaps, will your long prosperity be allowed to continue. Daniel's concluding address delivered a potent mixture of dread and fragile optimism. The choice lay nakedly before the sovereign, stark and terrifying, like two divergent pathways vanishing into an endless, dark forest. One road promised genuine humility and the continuance of his reign under a newfound wisdom. The other path twisted inexorably toward utter madness and a desolate displacement from the civilized company of all men. Nebuchadnezzar nodded once, slowly, his massive crown feeling suddenly heavy on his brow. With an almost imperceptible wave of his hand, he silently dismissed the assembled court. Alone now in his vast throne chamber, his eyes drifted across the monumental walls, staring blankly at the elaborate, frescoed fortifications that depicted the ceaseless chronicle of his own triumphs. Precious metal bulls and massive, winged lions, crafted of gold and inlaid with lapis lazuli, gazed back at him with cold, jeweled eyes. The terrifying clarity of the vision starkly conflicted with the material reality of his opulent surroundings, the awesome, silent threat of natural magnificence against the boastful, mortal artifice of his empire, the terrifying weight of divine judgment against the fleeting, earthly authority he had assumed was absolute. For one brief, heart-stopping instant, a flicker of true humility contacted the deepest core of his being. He contemplated the young prophet Daniel's words, about true compassion for the wretched, about submitting to an invisible authority infinitely greater than his own imperial will. But the strange, uncomfortable sensation passed quickly, dissolving like a thin cloud scudding across the blinding face of the sun. 12 months stretched ahead of him, a probationary span of grace. 12 months to definitively prove the vision wrong, to demonstrate to himself and to the universe that no unseen, celestial being could possibly humble the mighty sovereign of Babylon. The image of the magnificent, yet irrevocably doomed tree remained vividly etched in his recollection. Soon, he would discover if the destinies distributed to trees and to individuals were, in fact, the same when they grew too powerful and too proud for their own supporting roots to sustain them. That fatal instant of pride was sealed, and the 12 months passed with the swiftness of water slipping through cupped, rigid hands. Spring yielded its green freshness to the searing heat of summer. Summer surrendered to the gold and crimson decay of autumn, and autumn was soon swallowed by the paralyzing chill of winter. The specific, frightening details of the vision slowly faded from his continuous, day-to-day recollection, though its shadow never genuinely departed the periphery of his mind. Nebuchadnezzar continued to govern his immense dominion with the same relentless iron will, to construct his soaring monuments with the same magnificent, almost maniacal aspiration, and to receive tribute with the same unwavering royal satisfaction. The roof of the governmental complex, the great royal palace, had become his private, favorite retreat. Here, suspended high above the chaotic noise and ceaseless activity of the sprawling metropolis, he could survey his domain in complete, isolating solitude. The perspective extending outward was utterly beyond human conception. Great irrigation channels threaded through the densely packed districts below like looping, silver ribbons. The legendary suspended gardens cascaded down the immense, stepped fortifications, and the sacred buildings, the temples and ziggurats, pointed fiercely toward the heavens like massive lances crafted of polished masonry and precious, gleaming metal. On this particular, fateful day, the sun hung suspended, low and precious, in the western atmosphere. Evening was approaching with a gentle, inviting warmth. The sovereign ascended the familiar, wide stairs to his high sanctuary, breathing deeply of the cooling atmosphere, which was richly perfumed with the intoxicating scent of jasmine and myrrh wafting up from the stepped terraces of the hanging gardens below. Babylon extended beneath him in all its staggering magnificence. The vast Euphrates waterway curved powerfully through the very core of the metropolis, its waters reflecting the last, fractured light of the setting sun like a billion scattered, antique coins. Trader vessels docked at the masonry quays, unloading rare treasures from territories so remote they were merely names in a ledger. The trading centers still bustled with feverish activity even as the shadows of the immense city lengthened dramatically. The magnificent Edamananke ziggurat, The Temple of Marduk ascended majestically toward the heavens, its 7 tiers painted a deep, glowing crimson and gold by the setting sun. Beyond the fortified perimeter of the metropolis, the dominion stretched flawlessly to every horizon. Pathways, straight as the flight path of a fired projectile, connected Babylon to provinces separated by countless, unforgiving distances. Somewhere far beyond the immediate sightline, his military forces maintained the enforced peace. His administrators efficiently collected the annual tribute. His traders extended the far reach of Babylonian culture and economic power to the edges of the recognized world. The sovereign breathed deeply again, allowing the sheer, visceral satisfaction to saturate his lungs. This instant felt profoundly perfect, the ultimate culmination of decades of ruthless effort. It was the rich fruit of countless confrontations achieved and whole metropolitan areas conquered. Everything his eye could now perceive belonged utterly to him. Every individual within these massive fortifications existed solely by his imperial grace and authority. He contemplated other sovereigns, those who had arrived before and vanished, and those who now governed only paltry, lesser kingdoms. None could possibly match the staggering scale of what he, Nebuchadnezzar, had accomplished. The pharaohs of Egypt constructed their pyramids, yes, but their dominion perpetually crumbled at its edges. The sovereigns of Assyria once governed with apprehension and terror, but Clear's throat, their once great capital city, now rested in desolate ruins. Even the great, revered David and the magnificent Solomon of Israel never commanded such limitless wealth and such expansive territory. "Look at this magnificent Babylon," he declared aloud, his voice carrying clearly on the cool evening breeze. The words felt utterly satisfying, a potent wine on his tongue. So he continued, amplifying his volume. "Look at what I, myself, have constructed as the royal residence by the sheer, unyielding force of my mighty authority and purely for the eternal magnificence of my majesty." The declaration rang out, echoing across the silent rooftop. No one else stood near enough to hear, yet the sovereign was speaking directly to the universe itself. These words expressed nothing less than the fundamental truth as he perceived it. Every single brick in every fortification bore his specific royal mark. Every grand thoroughfare followed the meticulous plans he had personally endorsed. Every suspended garden grew exactly according to his precise aesthetic perspective. The hanging gardens cascaded beneath him in a terrifying spectacle of stepped splendor. If they truly existed, and from this immense elevation, they certainly appeared undeniably real, they represented the pinnacle of mortal human accomplishment. Water flowed miraculously upward through concealed channels, appearing to defy the gravity of nature itself. Trees from every known climate prospered side by side. Flowers bloomed in arrangements far more magnificent than any accident of a natural meadow. "My mighty authority," he repeated, savoring the sound of the phrase. His military forces numbered in the hundreds of thousands. His treasury overflowed constantly with gold and silver. His endless construction initiatives were literally transforming the landscape itself. Waterways bent obediently to his will. Mountains yielded their precious masonry for his endless monuments. The very earth reshaped itself at his simple directive. "For the magnificence of my majesty," the words floated on the atmosphere, still warm from the day's heat. His magnificence, he believed, illuminated more brilliantly than the dying sun, now setting behind remote, purple elevations. Poets composed verses about his accomplishments that would endure 1,000 years. Creative individuals carved his imperial image in massive masonry and cast it in precious metals. His very identity traveled to territories he had never even perceived, communicated always with a chilling mixture of awe and apprehension. The instant extended like thick honey poured from a container. Satisfaction saturated every deep territory of his core. This, finally, was what it signified to be sovereign, not merely of a metropolis or a population, but of the entire known world itself. This was the deserved compensation for a lifetime of struggle, sacrifice, and aspiration. This was the fruit of royal destiny perfectly fulfilled. But even as the final words departed his lips, something terrible transformed the atmosphere around him. The evening breeze died suddenly, completely. Birds immediately halted their singing in the gardens below. A profound, crushing burden pressed down from the rapidly darkening atmosphere, substantial and heavy as storm clouds made of granite, yet silent as mortality itself. The sovereign continued speaking, tragically unaware of the catastrophic shift in the cosmos. I have constructed this magnificent Babylon. My authority rendered it possible. My majesty deserves such magnificence. Each word transported farther than the last, resonating unervingly off the palace fortifications and the masonry of the sacred buildings. The sound seemed to extend beyond the physical metropolis, contacting realms invisible to mortal eyes. Somewhere in that vast, silent expanse of atmosphere, something acknowledged. The same unseen presence that had communicated in his vision 12 months earlier now fully perceived these final, arrogant words of ultimate pride. The duration of grace had abruptly concluded. The terrifying instant of judgment had arrived. Still, the sovereign communicated on, intoxicated by the heady fumes of his own accomplishments. Who among the divine beings can possibly match what I have executed? What kingdom can compare to mine? I have rendered myself the wonder of the entire world. The sun finally contacted the horizon, momentarily painting the atmosphere in shocking shades of molten gold and deep crimson. Shortly, physical darkness would descend over Babylon. But first, another type of darkness would descend upon its sovereign, a consuming darkness of consciousness and spirit that would transform him from the governor of nations to a mere creature of the field. The final, boastful words hung suspended in the cooling atmosphere like the dense, slow-moving smoke of forbidden incense. Below, the metropolis continued its predictable evening rhythm. Palace guards exchanged rotations. Traders slowly closed their stalls. Families assembled for evening meals. None of them understood that history was pivoting violently on this high rooftop instant. That their sovereign's final, catastrophic pride had just irrevocably sealed his destiny. The vision's original caution resonated faintly, deep in the recesses of his recollection. Something about acknowledging heaven's governance, about humility and compassion. But those faint murmurs could not compete with the deafening roar of present, triumphant pride. The sovereign gazed out over his dominion one last time with eyes that perceived perfectly clear. Shortly, very shortly, those eyes would perceive nothing mortal, nothing familiar, whatsoever. The declaration of the 7 times arrived from the heavens themselves, cutting through the heavy evening atmosphere like a sharpened sword slicing through silk. King Nebuchadnezzar, this is what is decreed for you. Your royal authority has been extracted from you. You will be driven away from the company of men and will exist with the wild creatures. You will consume grass like the ox. 7 times will pass over you until you finally acknowledge that the Most High governs over all the kingdoms of the earth and grants them to anyone he desires. The words struck his very being like bolts of lightning. Before their resonance had fully faded, the sovereign's consciousness commenced to fracture violently. Reasoning fled his mind like a panicked flock of birds escaping a burning forest. Recollection scattered like dry leaves caught in a sudden whirlwind. The powerful individual who had just proclaimed his own unmatchable majesty now stared with blank eyes that perceived nothing familiar, nothing mortal, nothing remotely civilized. His servants discovered him the next morning, not on his royal bed, but crawling frantically on the governmental complex floor. His royal garments hung in shredded tatters from his frame. His hair, once carefully groomed and oiled, hung wild and matted across his face, filthy and snarled. His fingernails had already commenced to intensify, displaying the terrifying curve that would characterize his approaching years of savagery. When the palace protectors approached, he snarled fiercely like a cornered, wounded creature. The palace physicians examined him with trembling, terrified hands. They possessed no name for this bizarre madness, no remedy in their scrolls or their complex potions. The greatest sovereign in the known world had become something terrifyingly hybrid, a being situated between an individual and a creature. His eyes displayed no recognition of faces he had known for decades. Words emerged from his throat only as guttural growls and pathetic whimpers. Governmental complex administrators immediately assembled in urgent, fearful conference. How does one administer a massive dominion when the emperor himself grazes on his hands and knees? How do you preserve order when utter disorder has violently seized the throne itself? Couriers waited endlessly for directives that would never arrive. Ambassadors pursued audiences with a sovereign who no longer recalled how to speak. The resolution arrived, wrapped in desperate necessity and political secrecy. They would conceal the sovereign's horrific condition. Official proclamations would continue to bear his imperial seal, though other hands now guided the stylus. His crown prince and his most trusted consultants would govern in secrecy while desperately preserving the fiction of the royal presence. The dominion must never understand that its head had descended into pure, terrifying madness. Deep within the governmental complex, they prepared a private garden, fortified with high walls and heavily protected, completely concealed from public perspective. Here, the sovereign would exist out his sentence. Servants tended him from a mandatory distance, leaving sustenance and water, cleaning up his messes like those of any confined, wild creature. He displayed no recognition of their compassion or their deep apprehension. Days blurred meaninglessly into weeks. The individual who once commanded millions now commanded nothing, not even his own body's basic requirements. He rested on the bare, cold ground under the open sky. Rain soaked him to the bone. The fierce sun burned his exposed skin. The relentless cycle of the seasons became his only calendar. Though he lacked the consciousness to mark their passage, his physical appearance transformed with horrifying rapidity. Hair grew long and hopelessly matted, collecting dirt and debris. Fingernails extended into grotesque claws unsuited for any mortal task. His skin, once pampered with oils and perfumes, became thick, rough, and deeply weathered. Muscles wasted away from inadequate nutrition and the absence of proper exercise. But the deeper transformation occurred within. The keen, calculating intelligence that once analyzed treaties and planned vast campaigns vanished completely. Strategic contemplation surrendered entirely to creature instinct. Language vanished, replaced by wordless sounds expressing only basic requirements and raw sentiments. The individual who conversed with oracles and philosophers now communicated precisely like any creature of the field. His regimen shifted to match his altered state. Rich sustenance from the royal kitchens held no appeal. Instead, he grazed mindlessly on grass and weeds, his digestive system somehow adapting to process what mortal stomachs were never intended to handle. Water from palace fountains sustained him, though he lapped it up like any four-legged beast. Seasons passed, unmarked by mortal festivity or recognition. Spring brought fresh, vigorous growth in his concealed garden. Summer heat beat down mercilessly on his unprotected form. Autumn leaves collapsed around him unnoticed. Winter cold numbed his barely clothed body. 7 times the earth completed its full journey around the sun, while the sovereign of Babylon existed as something less than mortal. The dominion continued its mechanical routines. Levies were collected, though the sovereign could no longer count coins. Judgment was administered, though he comprehended no regulation or law. Military forces marched to remote confrontations while their supreme commander crawled through the grass, blindly pursuing something edible. The apparatus of administration operated purely on existing momentum and the desperate ability of subordinates who dared not admit their leader's condition. Foreign ambassadors received polite, weary excuses. The sovereign is indisposed. They were told he had assumed ill. He pursued significant faith retreats. Official portraits continued to display him in full royal regalia, though the individual himself would not recognize his own reflection. State ceremonies proceeded with vacant thrones and elaborate, hollow explanations. In the concealed garden, duration moved differently. Without clocks or calendars, without mortal interaction or civilized routine, existence became a perpetual present. Hunger led only to consuming. Thirst drove him to water. Rest arrived when exhaustion demanded it. No higher contemplations disturbed this simple, base cycle. Weather became his only companion. He learned instinctively to pursue shelter from storms, to discover shade during the heat of the day. His body adapted to outdoor existence in ways that would astound the royal physicians if any were permitted to examine him. Skin toughened against the elements. Senses sharpened to detect subtle dangers and opportunities. He became a creature perfectly suited to his reduced, animalistic circumstances. The magnificent constructor of Babylon displayed no interest in construction now. Monuments that once saturated him with pride might as well have been natural rock formations. The hanging gardens that crowned his accomplishment produced no recognition, offering only occasional fruit to supplement his regimen of grass and weeds. Yet somewhere profound within, beneath thick layers of madness and creature-like existence, a faint spark of humanity endured. Not consciousness as human beings comprehend it, but something essential, a kernel of self that patiently waited for its designated instant of restoration. The divine directive specified 7 times, and duration continued its patient, silent count toward that remote, destined moment of restoration. Governmental complex servants who tended the concealed garden occasionally paused in their obligations, gazing fearfully at the figure. They remembered the sovereign as he was proud, brilliant, terrible in his authority and spectacular in his aspiration. Now he rested, curled and pathetic, on the bare earth. His ragged breathing was the only sound in the location where once royal directives had resonated sharply off marble fortifications. 7 times, 7 passages of seasons, 7 complete years of displacement from everything that renders existence mortal. The mightiest sovereign of the classical world endured his sentence in silence, waiting for the celestial clock to complete its count and for sanity to restore like the slow, inevitable dawn. After the longest night, the restoration of reasoning began. The 7th year drew slowly toward its conclusion like a massive curtain slowly descending onto a stage. Autumn painted the governmental complex garden in shades of deep gold and bloody crimson. Morning mist adhered heavily to the grass, thick with dew. In this concealed sanctuary, a figure moved sluggishly on his hands and knees among the dying flowers, mortal in form, but creature in every other manner. For 7 years, duration had passed without significance. Seasons transformed without recognition. Day followed night, a brutal, perpetual cycle, while a consciousness once sharp as hammered steel lay buried beneath layers of madness, as thick and isolating as winter snow. The sovereign of Babylon had become a creature of pure, raw instinct, driven only by hunger, thirst, and the requirement for shelter. But this morning brought something entirely different. The atmosphere itself appeared charged with a heavy possibility, like the tense instant just before lightning strikes the earth. A powerful, unseen presence hovered just beyond the edge of physical perception. The same divine force that had communicated judgment 7 years ago now prepared to communicate restoration. The sun ascended higher, slowly burning away the cold mist. Birds sang vibrantly in the branches overhead. Somewhere in the distance, palace existence continued its familiar rhythms. Protectors exchanged rotations. Servants hurried through corridors. Administrators debated policy in assembly chambers. None of them understood that history stood poised to pivot once again. The figure in the garden slowly lifted his head. For the initial occasion in 7 agonizing years, his eyes concentrated deliberately on something beyond immediate creature requirement. He perceived the sky, not just a source of weather, but as a vast, impossible dome extending beyond conception. Clouds drifted across the perpetual azure expanse like immense vessels on an infinite sea. The sight awakened something long dormant within him, like embers glowing suddenly beneath cold ash. His gaze dropped from the heavens to the earth, and genuine wonder commenced. Grass grew in perfect, geometric configurations. Flowers bloomed in arrangements no accident could ever generate. Water flowed in channels that served both magnificence and objective purpose. Even in his degraded state, some submerged portion of him instantly recognized design, intelligence, and a deliberate intent behind what surrounded him. Slowly, carefully, he lifted his eyes to the heavens once more. This simple act carried a crushing burden beyond description. For 7 years, his perspective had never ascended above ground level. Now, something drew his concentration upward, a pull stronger than gravity, more compelling than hunger or thirst. As he gazed into the perpetual azure, awareness flooded back like a torrent of water through a fractured dam. Recollection restored in cascading, shocking waves. He recalled words, complex concepts, and relationships. He recalled his own identity, his great kingdom, his high throne. He recalled the vision of the magnificent tree and the precise caution he had so foolishly chosen to disregard. But most significantly, he recalled the divine being who had communicated that judgment, not as a remote theological concept, but as an existing, terrifying presence who maintains promises, even the hard promises of discipline. The same authority that had reduced him to creature-like existence now provided restoration. The same voice that had pronounced sentence now seemed to whisper the possibility of pardon. Comprehension bloomed in his consciousness like flowers opening after rain. He perceived the whole configuration now. Pride leading to judgment, judgment leading to forced humility, and humility opening the portal to grace. 7 years of profound madness were not mere punishment, but education. A terrifying elemental teaching no royal instructor could ever supply. His lips, silent for so long except for creature sounds, commenced to form words. At first, only faint murmurs, then stronger declarations. "I praise the Most High," he communicated. His voice rusty and grating from disuse, but growing clearer with each painful syllable. "I recognize and glorify Him who exists eternally." The words felt strange on his tongue, yet perfectly correct. For 7 years he had communicated no language whatsoever. Now, his initial coherent speech acknowledged the very sovereignty he had once so arrogantly denied. The sovereign who had proclaimed his own majesty now proclaimed a greater majesty that would never conclude. "His dominion is eternal," he continued, power flowing back into his voice like blood into dead limbs. "His kingdom endures from generation to generation. All the populations of the earth are regarded as nothing. He executes as he pleases with the authorities of the heavens and the populations of the earth. Nobody can restrain his hand or communicate to him. What have you executed?" Each word marked another tremendous step away from madness toward restored sanity. His consciousness cleared like morning fog burning off under a strong, vertical sun. Intelligence restored, not just the cold calculation that constructed a dominion, but wisdom, the wisdom that recognizes its proper, humble position in the larger order of existence. Recollection flooded back in tremendous, overwhelming waves. He recalled Daniel's detailed interpretation of his vision. He recalled the caution about pride and the promise of restoration when he acknowledged heaven's governance. That instant had arrived like sunrise after the longest night. His body commenced to transform even as his consciousness cleared. Hair that grew wild and matted for 7 years somehow arranged itself into a more mortal appearance. Nails that had curved like vicious claws progressively restored to normal length and configuration. Skin weathered by years of exposure regained something of its former smoothness. The transformation occurred slowly but surely, as if divine hands were actively reshaping what madness had violently distorted. Servants who tended the garden from a distance noticed the transformation initially. They murmured among themselves, hardly daring to believe their terrified eyes. The creature they had nourished and cleaned up after for 7 years now positioned himself upright, communicated coherent words, and observed them with recognition instead of creature weariness. Word spread through the governmental complex like wildfire. Administrators who had governed in darkness for 7 years assembled in urgent, breathless assembly. Could it possibly be accurate? Had the sovereign's reasoning genuinely been restored? They approached the garden with a combination of optimism and sheer terror, desperately uncertain what they would discover. When they perceived him, numerous prostrated themselves instantly to their knees. This was their sovereign, transformed, humbled, deeply scarred by his ordeal, but unmistakably the individual who had once governed with absolute authority. His eyes possessed a depth they had never displayed before, as if he had perceived achievements beyond mortal conception, and had returned solely to recount the account. "My consultants and aristocrats pursued me out," he would later inscribe. "I was restored to my throne, and I became even greater than before. But initially arrived the private instant of recognition, the full acknowledgement that transformed not just his consciousness, but his very soul. The sovereign who had once declared his own majesty now communicated only of another's boundless greatness. The governor who credited his own authority for every accomplishment now recognized the true source of all authority. The constructor who claimed credit for Babylon's magnificence now comprehended who genuinely governs the ascent and descent of all kingdoms. His restoration, a profound reversal of fortune, is not achieved through the ministrations of earthly physicians or the issuance of a royal decree, but solely through the immeasurable compassion of the heavens, manifesting precisely at the terminus ad quem, the appointed time. The long night of judgment, 7 full years of existential exile, concludes to the exact day the divine will had ordained. The sentence completes itself down to the very hour, demonstrating that even the relentless march of duration assists objectives far beyond the grasp of mortal comprehension. As the astonishing news of the king's restored reason spreads like wildfire from the palace, the Babylonian Empire rouses itself, shaking off its 7-year slumber. The vast dominion stirs, awakening like a slumbering giant waking from rest. Swift dispatches fly across the Fertile Crescent and beyond to remote satrapies. Armies receive crisp, unambiguous orders replacing the years of cautious inertia. Administrators, many having grown wealthy and comfortable in the king's absence, scramble to reconcile the accounts they had deliberately left vague or delayed for years. Shashafan, the intricate apparatus of governance that had been operating on cautious autopilot for such an extended period, now receives definitive guidance from its legitimate, restored head. Yet, the restored ruler is fundamentally transformed. The individual who resumes the golden authority is a shadow of the arrogant monarch who abandoned it 7 years prior. His overwhelming pride, that fatal flaw that brought him low, has been utterly consumed, refined like dross burned from precious, purified gold. Humility, a virtue utterly alien to his former self, has taken deep root in the soul once choked only by self-worship and imperial self-regard. The experience of utter, terrifying helplessness has ingrained profound instructions that no quantity of worldly achievement or conquest could ever supply. As the deep Mesopotamian twilight settles, he finds himself in his private gardens. He gazes upward at the celestial expanse, the first sharp pinpricks of light appearing in the darkening dome. These same ancient stars bore silent witness to his descent into bestial madness and, now, to his miraculous return to lucidity. He realizes with profound clarity that these distant, burning worlds will continue their timeless, majestic dance long after the great walls of Babylon have crumbled to dust. This contemplation brings a quiet, profound sense of peace rather than the familiar dread, replacing the former sovereign's imperial fury with deep, hard-won wisdom. Tomorrow, the protocols of state dictate he will reclaim his throne, resume the burdens of command, and begin the arduous task of repairing the systemic neglect of 7 years. But this night, this crucial hinge between past and future, belongs entirely to boundless gratitude and silent wonder. The transcendent power that brought him to utter ruin has now, mercifully, raised him up. The authority that delivered the striking blow has chosen to restore him fully. In the act of relinquishing everything, he has acquired a treasure infinitely more valuable than all the crowns of the earth. The restored sovereign of Babylon lifts his gaze one final time toward the celestial sphere. It is no longer a gesture of challenge or defiance, but one of deep, abiding reverence. The harrowing path, from overweening pride, through terrifying madness, to true humility, and finally to restoration, is complete. A new epoch is set to begin, its terms dictated not by mortal ambition, but inscribed by hands far more capable than any human administrator. Babylon post-madness. The immense throne chamber now crackles with a palpably different energy, a vibrancy unknown during the 7 years of interregnum. Court officials who had become complacent, comfortable governing in the institutional shadows of the king's absence, now blink and adjust to the pure, sharp sunlight that streams in, seemingly intensified by the sovereign's very presence. Nebuchadnezzar takes his seat upon the monumental, gold-encrusted throne. But his authority is still undeniable, a palpable force radiating from his imposing frame, yet it carries a profoundly altered resonance. It is power now masterfully tempered by profound humility, authority seasoned, not by conquest, but by devastating personal wisdom. His first royal directive sends a collective shockwave through the assembled court. Instead of the anticipated retribution, the immediate discipline of those who had contained and concealed his condition, he astonishingly commends them for their difficult loyalty and devotion to the realm's stability. Instead of aggressively seizing back every thread of state governance, he listens with remarkable patience to the detailed, often defensive, accounts offered by the temporary administrators who had kept the intricate machinery of the empire grinding forward. The sovereign who once demanded instant, absolute control now demonstrates a patience that borders on the divine, deeply aware of the complexities of the human spirit. The transformation extends far beyond matters of policy. It permeates his very being. His voice, when addressing the assembly, carries a new weight and influence. His words are delivered more deliberately, chosen with a meticulous care that signals the deep significance behind every utterance. Advisors who had braced themselves for the return of the same impulsive, volatile monarch find themselves instead engaged with a ruler who truly contemplates before pronouncing judgment, a man who consistently weighs consequences far beyond the immediate political or personal benefit. Construction initiatives, always the hallmark of his reign, resume but with a dramatically altered focus. Where before he commissioned colossal monuments designed solely to immortalize his own magnificence, he now prioritizes the restoration of essential infrastructure benefiting his subjects. Primary pathways and vital trade routes receive immediate attention over the glorification of governmental complexes. Crucial irrigation systems now assume undeniable priority over the aesthetically pleasing, but economically non-essential, decorative suspended gardens. The sovereign who once built solely for eternal posterity now builds for immediate practical purpose. His relationship with the exiled Hebrew population undergoes perhaps the most remarkable transformation of all. Daniel, the sagacious oracle who interpreted his terrifying visions and dared to warn him of his impending fall, now receives unprecedented public recognition and institutional access. The very ruler who once, in a fit of rage, commanded that Daniel's 3 companions be thrown into a blazing furnace now actively seeks the Hebrews' counsel on matters of justice, governance, and divine compassion. Religious tolerance, a concept foreign to his previous centralized rule, is now extended through policies that would have been completely unthinkable in earlier years. Even the magnificent Etemenanke, Babylon's towering ziggurat, receives fresh, urgent attention, though not for the imperialistic reasons the court administrators readily assume. The sovereign orders comprehensive repairs to its structure and improvements to its functionality as a place of legitimate reverence. But when he ascends its 7 monumental tiers, reaching the platform that symbolically touches the heavens, he no longer does so to vaunt his own imperial authority. Instead, he climbs seeking to humbly recalibrate his own minute position within the colossal, ordered architecture of creation itself. Commerce continues to flow through the heart of Babylon, pulsating like lifeblood through the dominion's vast arteries. However, the sovereign now enforces rigorous oversight concerning fair trade practices, honest weights and standardized measurements, and the respectful treatment of all foreign traders. The immense wealth that founded and sustained his empire now serves broader objectives than mere royal aggrandizement. While wealth accumulation remains, a strategic portion of the imperial reserves is directed toward the most vulnerable, those requiring essential support. His revised construction plans now include something entirely unprecedented in the annals of Babylonian history: public works that serve no ceremonial or self-glorifying function whatsoever. He orders the construction of public bathhouses for the common citizenry, integrated schools where the children of merchants and traders can learn alongside aristocratic sons, and hospitals where the sick receive care and attention irrespective of their financial capacity to compensate. The sovereign who once built only for the judgment of eternity now dedicates substantial resources to the welfare of the immediate present. Even the strict world of the royal harem undergoes subtle, yet deeply significant transformations. While political marriages remain necessary instruments for forging crucial diplomatic relations, the sovereign now treats his many wives with a respect often conspicuously absent in previous years. His numerous offspring receive comprehensive education that integrates rigorous moral instruction alongside essential preparation for future governance. The next generation of the royal line grows up observing a paternal figure who publicly acknowledges an authority fundamentally higher than his own absolute decree. The bureaucratic governmental complex must now drastically adapt to its transformed master. Court administrators who had previously excelled by competing for royal favor through elaborate flattery now realize that unflinching honesty yields profoundly superior results. Officials who built entire careers on telling the sovereign precisely what he desired to hear suddenly discover that truth-telling has become the most valuable currency in the royal exchange. The atmosphere within the palace lightens perceptibly as the pervasive apprehension diminishes, replaced by a deep, earned mutual respect. Foreign ambassadors and envoys notice the astonishing transformation instantaneously. Diplomatic negotiations, which once proceeded solely via thinly veiled threats and blunt intimidation, now incorporate genuine, considered attempts at finding mutual advantage and lasting stability. Treaties become notably less one-sided, though Babylon's undisputed might still ensures fundamentally favorable terms. The Dominion's strategic expansion continues, but it is executed with significantly less brutality and a far greater focus on governing conquered territories with demonstrable justice and fairness. The sovereign's new continuous routine faithfully reflects his profoundly altered perspective. Each morning begins with a humble acknowledgement of divine authority, not a dramatic, elaborate pagan ritual, but a simple, heartfelt recognition of transcendent forces beyond his earthly power. Evenings often find him slowly traversing the extensive palace gardens, quietly observing the relentless processes of growth and transformation that so perfectly mirror his own internal renewal. Rest arrives more readily to a mind no longer tormented by the ceaseless, insatiable craving for conquest and self-glorification. Military affairs now receive the same measured, thoughtful attention previously reserved for civilian governance. The Babylonian military remains the strongest, best-equipped fighting force in the known world, yet its deployment and utilization become significantly more strategic and far less capricious. Rebellions still face swift, decisive discipline, but negotiation and diplomacy now frequently precede the application of overwhelming force. Conquered populations discover that their local traditions and customs are generally respected, provided they pose no actual danger to imperial stability. The magnificent royal archive of Babylon, a staggering collection of clay tablets and papyrus scrolls gathered from every corner of the recognized world, receives heightened and crucial emphasis. The sovereign mandates the meticulous duplication of essential texts and the aggressive preservation of ancient knowledge that might otherwise be lost forever. Learning flourishes under a royal patronage that now recognizes the inherent value of truth, regardless of its originating source. The character of his palace entertainments subtly shifts as well. While music and celebratory dancing continue, the sovereign now expresses a marked preference for performances that genuinely elevate the spirit, rather than merely providing frivolous amusement. Poets who once competed to compose bombastic verses praising only royal magnificence now find encouragement for works that explore deeper philosophical and moral themes. Creative expression and high culture now prosper in directions that nurture the human, mortal spirit. Babylon's standing throughout the classical world adjusts profoundly to this new reality. The city remains an unquestionable metropolis, mighty, fabulously wealthy, and architecturally magnificent. But now, far-flung chronicles carry tales of a sovereign who extracted profound wisdom through intense personal suffering, a ruler who governs with an even-handed justice deeply tempered by compassion. Some observers attribute the transformation to radical divine intervention. Others credit the natural maturation of a genuinely great leader. All, however, are forced to agree that something truly remarkable and indelible has occurred. The Hanging Gardens, whether entirely legendary or physically existent, receive fresh attention and dedicated maintenance. But they now serve as a sanctuary for contemplation as much as they are an ostentatious display of imperial engineering. The sovereign frequently walks their stepped pathways in quiet reflection, remembering the years when he saw such splendor but utterly lacked the crucial wisdom to appreciate its deeper, enduring significance. Archives throughout the vast dominion receive explicit directives to meticulously document not only royal accomplishments and victories, but also the profound lessons extracted from grievous personal failures. The sovereign's own terrifying experience is incorporated into the official state history, not as a source of embarrassment, but as a critical instruction. Future rulers are meant to understand that even the most powerful monarch remains perpetually subject to forces wholly beyond human control. Commercial guilds and trader associations find that their collective voices are heard and seriously considered in ways previously unimaginable. Economic policy now consciously reflects their legitimate concerns regarding fair competition and the stability of crucial trading centers. The Dominion's already legendary prosperity broadens significantly as the accumulated wealth begins to distribute more equitably throughout the various strata of the civilization. Religious practice throughout Babylon becomes remarkably more tolerant without sacrificing essential social structure. Local deities and ancient traditions continue to receive recognition, but new conceptual space opens up for fresh philosophies regarding divine nature and mortal responsibility. The sovereign who once aggressively enforced theological uniformity now permits a measured diversity within boundaries essential to preserving social order. As the initial months of his return ripen into years, Nebuchadnezzar's profound transformation ceases to be an anomaly and rapidly establishes itself as the new normal. Court officials cease anticipating a fearful reversion to his former impulsive methods. Foreign kingdoms adjust their diplomatic strategies to account for his consistent, altered character. The entire dominion settles into reliable rhythms that reflect the governor's hard-earned, internalized wisdom. The sovereign himself appears most truly at peace during quiet, contemplative moments. Absorbing detailed accounts in his private study, walking slowly through the cooling gardens as evening descends, or simply watching his children and grandchildren engaging in play within the vast palace courtyards. These simple, profound pleasures, once completely overshadowed by megalomaniacal aspirations, now yield a deep satisfaction that no military conquest or earthly monument could ever provide. Babylon remains undeniably the greatest metropolis of its epoch, a shimmering jewel of engineering and commerce. But its definition of greatness now encompasses qualities that radically transcend mere physical magnitude and material wealth. Judgment, compassion, profound wisdom, and abiding humility have taken their place alongside sheer military authority and economic prosperity as the critical pillars supporting the golden throne. The sovereign who once fell from the heavens' favor has ascended once more, but to an altogether different, more sustainable form of elevation. Nebuchadnezzar and the Jews, a complicated, enduring legacy. The relationship between Babylon's greatest sovereign and the displaced Hebrew population is a profound paradox woven inextricably into the tapestry of history, a complex thread combining precious metal and unforgiving iron. Nebuchadnezzar mercilessly destroyed their sacred temple, violently scattered their population, and brought a definitive, brutal end to their kingdom. Yet, this very same individual, the instrument of their destruction, became the unlikely vessel through which the Hebrew deity displayed transcendent authority to the surrounding pagan territories. No narrative in the entire classical world possesses such complex paradox, such intricate layering of divine purpose actively working through naked mortal ambition. The conflict commenced not out of theological hatred, but necessity brutally disguised as political subjugation. Jerusalem stood as the final, frustrating impediment to complete Babylonian control over the immensely profitable western trade routes. The city's formidable fortifications protected far more than just population and treasure. They sheltered the ultimate, stubborn remnant of organized opposition to imperial dominion. On 3 distinct occasions, Nebuchadnezzar's mighty legions marched upon the city, demanding immediate submission. 3 times, the city's stubborn leaders chose political rebellion over the pragmatic necessity of surrender. The initial siege, however, yielded a negotiated compromise. Tribute flowed from Jerusalem to Babylon, and the compliance of the city was ensured by the surrender of royal hostages. Specifically, bright young aristocrats like Daniel and his companions, brilliant minds destined to serve the dominion while their fragile homeland absorbed the hard lesson of obedience. This fragile arrangement might well have endured for generations, had not the corrosive influence of pride infected both sides of the pact. But pride runs deep in royal bloodlines. King Zedekiah of Judah, intoxicated by false hope, looked south to Egypt for military support against his Babylonian overlords. Open tribute was replaced by secret, treasonous negotiations. Rebellion simmered violently just beneath the surface of outward compliance. Nebuchadnezzar's sophisticated intelligence network brought irrefutable evidence of these treacheries, and the second siege commenced with a calculated fury born of profound political betrayal. This engagement brought significantly harsher terms. More hostages departed for Babylon. More treasure gorged the emperor's already overflowing reserves. The prophet Ezekiel now found himself numbered among the displaced, his voice crying out beside foreign waterways about impending judgment and the eventual, distant hope of restoration. Yet, even these measures failed to guarantee lasting peace. The third siege irrevocably ended Jerusalem's independence. The massive fortifications that had protected King David's capital city for generations finally crumbled under the relentless pressure of Babylonian siegecraft. The Holy Temple, constructed by Solomon's decree, was reduced to ashes as Nebuchadnezzar's warriors systematically stripped away every piece of precious metal and silver. The last king of Judah was forced to witness the summary execution of his own sons before having his eyes violently put out, a grim mercy that spared him the definitive sight of his kingdom's total obliteration. But this devastating obliteration and mass displacement served purposes far exceeding simple military necessity. The Hebrew prophets had warned for centuries that rampant unfaithfulness would ultimately invite divine judgment. Nebuchadnezzar, acting solely from political and imperial motivations, became the brutal, unwitting instrument of this celestial discipline. The pagan sovereign, who fervently served his own pantheon of deities, nevertheless precisely fulfilled the prophecies of the deity he refused to acknowledge. The displaced people who arrived broken and dispossessed in Babylon faced critical choices that would permanently shape their nation's future trajectory. They could choose total assimilation into the dominant imperial culture, surrendering their unique identity within the powerful melting pot of subjugation. They could choose hopeless rebellion and face guaranteed extinction. Or, crucially, they could preserve their core convictions while adaptively adjusting to new, often hostile circumstances, learning, as the psalmist pondered, to sing the Lord's song in an entirely foreign land. A significant portion of the exiles chose this third, most difficult path. Hebrew communities firmly established roots in the fertile Babylonian soil, diligently maintaining their spiritual orientation toward the distant, ruined Jerusalem. They mastered the dominion's languages and adapted many of its pragmatic traditions without ever truly abandoning their foundational customs. Children born in exile grew up as effective citizens of two distinct realms, Babylonian by their immediate birth, Hebrew by their sacred heritage. Daniel and his celebrated companions epitomized this delicate equilibrium. They served the sovereign loyally and competently in all state matters, except those that directly violated their deepest religious convictions. Their undeniable competence earned profound administrative respect, while their unwavering integrity commanded sincere admiration throughout the court. Through their remarkable success, the Hebrew deity secured an audience, a genuine hearing, at the very epicenter of the pagan empire. The sovereign's recurring, disturbing visions brought these complex tensions into sharp, undeniable focus. When all the learned Babylonian wise men and astrologers failed utterly to interpret his prophetic dreams, the Hebrew oracles consistently succeeded. Daniel's demonstrable ability to reveal concealed, celestial meanings showcased an authority that utterly transcended all mortal wisdom and imperial power. Nebuchadnezzar found himself inescapably confronted by a deity whose power definitively surpassed his own. Each of these dramatic divine encounters left an indelible mark on the emperor's understanding of the cosmos. The vision of the immense, composite statue revealed that earthly kingdoms rise and fall strictly according to celestial direction, not mortal strength. The miraculous rescue of Daniel's 3 friends from his terrifying furnace displayed a divine authority capable of overcoming any earthly, destructive force. The prophecy of the magnificent, felled tree warned of judgment arriving even for the mightiest rulers. Despite these profound lessons, Nebuchadnezzar fundamentally remained a pagan sovereign presiding over a fiercely pagan dominion. His intellectual acknowledgement of the Hebrew deity's authority did not equate to exclusive reverence or monotheistic conversion. Babylon's native gods retained their sacred temples and sacrifices. The dominion's theological diversity persisted, with the God of Israel gaining recognition as simply one powerful deity among many. This religious intricacy was a direct reflection of political reality. The Hebrew exiles were but one group among hundreds of displaced populations scattered across the dominion. Each community carefully preserved its traditions while simultaneously contributing essential skills and manpower to the imperial power structure. Babylon's inherent greatness derived, in part, from its sophisticated capacity to absorb, utilize, and manage diverse talents rather than crushing them all into forced, ineffective uniformity. The Hebrew administrators and chroniclers who meticulously documented these events were keenly aware of their deeply ambiguous position. Their brutal conqueror had also, paradoxically, become their temporary protector. The sovereign who systematically destroyed their holy center was the very man who preserved their lives and permitted their distinct culture to flourish in exile. Good and evil intermingled in ways that utterly defied simplistic moral judgment. Nebuchadnezzar's radical transformation during his 7 years of madness added yet another crucial layer to this already immense complexity. The genuinely humbled sovereign who returned to power displayed a dramatically heightened respect for the Hebrew deity and his people. Policy shifts consistently reflected this altered perspective, though they never approached anything resembling full conversion to exclusive monotheism. The unprecedented prosperity enjoyed by the exiles under enlightened Babylonian governance generated severe theological tensions that would linger for generations. If the divine being had judged his people through Nebuchadnezzar's conquest, did their subsequent success in exile indicate renewed divine favor or merely a further, subtler trial? Prophets like Jeremiah counseled steadfast patience and faithful waiting. Others aggressively called for active opposition or immediate restoration. Several highly capable Hebrews ascended to positions of immense influence and power within the imperial administration. Their achievements benefited both their own community and their adopted homeland. Nebuchadnezzar profited greatly from their organizational capacities and wisdom, while they, in turn, gained essential protection and opportunity that would have been completely unattainable in their devastated homeland. The sovereign's vast construction initiatives frequently utilized Hebrew craftspeople and skilled designers. Their abilities, honed in the construction of Solomon's temple, now contributed directly to Babylon's spectacular, world-renowned structures. Irony upon bitter irony. The very people whose temple was systematically destroyed helped to construct the permanent monuments to Babylonian magnificence. Robust commercial relationships rapidly developed between the established Hebrew communities and their Babylonian neighbors. Business partnerships routinely crossed deep ethnic and religious boundaries. Intermarriage occurred, sometimes frequently, despite theological prohibitions. The rigid lines separating conqueror and conquered began to blur significantly in the texture of continuous daily life, even while they remained starkly defined in official imperial policy. The Hebrew calendar and traditional festivals were meticulously maintained in displacement, though adapted to the pragmatic circumstances of Babylonian life. Sabbath observance became an increasingly vital marker of shared cultural identity rather than merely a religious obligation. Dietary regulations effectively distinguished the Hebrew communities from their neighbors while still permitting necessary participation in the broader imperial economy and social structure. Education played an absolutely vital role in preserving and transmitting Hebrew identity across the exiled generations. Fathers diligently taught their children the ancient language, the sacred chronicles, and the songs of their homeland. Community schools maintained traditional instruction while strategically incorporating the pragmatic knowledge required for success within Babylonian civilization. The reputation of the Hebrew deity subtly extended beyond narrow ethnic boundaries through these manifold interactions. Some astute Babylonians displayed genuine interest in Hebrew beliefs, though few completed the difficult journey to full conversion. The imperial court's demonstrable respect for Hebrew prophets and wise men created essential space for theological dialogue that would have been impossible under a less tolerant ruler. Nebuchadnezzar's legacy among the Hebrew population remains permanently, fundamentally complicated. He was at once obliterator and protector, mortal adversary and unwitting instrument of divine purpose, oppressor and inadvertent servant of celestial plans. He embodied a constellation of profound contradictions that perfectly reflected the mysterious, inscrutable manner in which divine providence operates through the messy reality of mortal history. The displacement that began as severe divine discipline ultimately became critical preparation. The scattered population would eventually return to reconstruct their ruined homeland, but they would never again be merely a small, isolated nation among others. Their formative experience in the vast cosmopolitan cauldron of Babylon had profoundly prepared them for a much larger, global role in human affairs, to be the bearers of unyielding monotheistic conviction to a relentlessly polytheistic world. The Hanging Gardens, legend or tangible reality? The question murmurs persistently through the corridors of time, sifting like dry wine through ancient foliage. One of the 7 wonders of the classical world, they are universally claimed. Yet beneath the accumulating dust of Babylon, absolutely no undeniable trace remains. Classical historians detailed multi-tiered, stepped gardens that seemingly ascended toward the sky like verdant, man-made mountains. Water was said to cascade down massive masonry steps in perpetual engineered streams. Exotic trees, imported from faraway territories, swayed gently in the unrelenting Mesopotamian heat. The intoxicating fragrance of blossoms reportedly drifted across the royal precinct, carried by the subtle breezes from the Euphrates. Greek historians, often describing marvels they never personally witnessed, provided vivid, compelling accounts. Strabo recorded immense, vaulted chambers designed to support the incredible weight of the deep soil and the massive tree roots. Diodorus Siculus painted word pictures of colossal stone pillars set 22 feet apart, with thick roots dangling like enormous, woven curtains. Josephus asserted their total expanse covered 400 feet on each side, ascending to heights rivaling the city's formidable fortifications. But a deafening silence echoes from Babylon's own indigenous documentation. Nebuchadnezzar's numerous royal inscriptions meticulously chronicle his exhaustive construction programs. He boasts openly of sacred temples reconstructed, colossal defensive fortifications strengthened, and governmental complexes lavishly adorned with gold and glazed brick. Never once do the Hanging Gardens appear in any of his official royal chronicles. Perhaps the legendary gardens flourished in an entirely different metropolis. Some modern scholars strongly suggest the site was actually Nineveh, where Assyrian sovereigns commissioned impressive stepped parks generations earlier. Sennacherib created vast terraced gardens, with water lifted to great heights using sophisticated bronze screws. His palace overlooked these lush, engineered spaces nourished by distant mountain streams. Is it possible that later, geographically distant writers simply confused the 2 great metropolitan areas? Or perhaps the wonder existed only in the potent realm of conception and imagination? Chronicles, after all, possess a life of their own, growing like tenacious vines that twist and dramatically enlarge around tiny kernels of factual truth. A large royal courtyard garden easily morphs into a spectacular mountain of blossoms. A luxurious governmental complex plaza is swiftly transformed in memory into a cascading paradise. Memory inexorably transforms details, adds vibrant pigments, and constructs fortifications higher than reality permits. Yet, there is a core element in the chronicle that feels intuitively authentic, as accounts driven by powerful emotion often do. The story asserts that Nebuchadnezzar constructed the magnificent gardens specifically for his principal wife, Amytis. She hailed from the perpetually green highlands of Media, a place where mountains touched the passing clouds and clear waterways sang through deep valleys. Babylon's relentlessly flat horizon induced a deep, consuming nostalgia for vertical landscapes. Picture her standing on the palace roof at dusk. The majestic Euphrates flows below like ribbons of molten precious metal. Date palms dot the vast distance, but they cannot possibly replace the dense, cool forests of her Median childhood. Her husband, the unchallenged master of the known world, cannot command mountains to instantly rise, nor highland mists to cool her summer evenings. So, perhaps, he attempted to construct her homeland in miniature. Stone masonry was shaped into artificial slopes. Channels were engineered into rushing streams. Gardeners planted cedars imported from Lebanon and flowers sourced from the remotest provinces. Designers constructed elaborate pumps to lift the massive quantities of water to the artificial heights. It was love expressed in monumental architecture. Profound yearning answered through unprecedented feats of engineering. Whether they physically existed matters less, in the end, than why generations of people believed they did. The gardens represent something far deeper and more resonant than mere horticulture. They speak of imperial power attempting to conquer the very laws of nature, of mortal ambition desperately reaching upward toward the concept of paradise. They embody the impossible rendered briefly possible through the unstoppable force of royal will. Modern archaeology, despite decades of exhaustive search, has unearthed no definitive trace. Spades meticulously turn up the vast foundations of the governmental complex, the shattered fortifications of temples, and ceremonial pathways paved with celebrated glazed bricks. The breathtaking Ishtar Gate emerges from generations of enveloping sand, but the fabled gardens remain frustratingly concealed, if they ever existed at all. Perhaps that absence is profoundly fitting. The true nature of wonder often thrives best when it remains enveloped in mystery. Concrete, verifiable evidence might only diminish the glorious aspiration. It is superior to allow the gardens to bloom eternally in the collective imagination, a conception where sovereigns can still, hypothetically, construct paradise for the people they deeply love. The absence of physical evidence thus becomes its own profound type of evidence. Not every essential chronicle requires physical artifacts for validation. Some narratives serve a completely different purpose. They reveal what mortals dare to aspire to, what love inspires us to ambitiously attempt. Ultimately, the hanging gardens flourish most magnificently in the fertile space between recorded history and undying optimism. They prosper in that deep, verdant ground where hard facts inevitably encounter powerful sentiment, where the physically possible dissolves into the infinitely, contacts the impossible. There, in soil composed of the accumulated centuries and forgotten chronicles, Nebuchadnezzar's magnificent gift to his displaced, nostalgic queen, the legendary hanging gardens, blooms eternal in human memory, defying the decay that claims all earthly monuments. Yet even this grand architect of permanence was subject to temporal laws. The mortality of Nebuchadnezzar, the great sovereign, loomed. 43 years of commanding governance drew inevitably toward their conclusion. The magnificent ruler, who had commanded nations and sculpted the landscape, aged like any common man despite all his unprecedented authority. Duration conquers even those powerful figures who conquer territories and subdue peoples. Mortality waits patiently, an invisible sentry guarding the final threshold for every crown. His ultimate, meticulously carved inscriptions mention completed sacred buildings, finished fortifications, and, crucially, satisfied divine beings. The royal voice emanating from these stone records sounds weary, perhaps faintly resigned, yet deeply content. I constructed Babylon magnificent, he declares in the monumental carved masonry, echoing the pride of a demiurge. I rendered her entire affairs illuminate like the sun. These carefully chosen words, intended to secure his legacy, would outlast the very flesh that dictated and communicated them. Age brought profound reflection. The harrowing, mad years had transformed him permanently. No longer did he assert divine status, nor did he demand the kind of unqualified reverence reserved for a divine being. His later inscriptions acknowledge authorities greater than sovereigns, forces beyond mortal or imperial control. Humility, earned through profound suffering, had intensified in the very soul where pride once prospered like a lavish weed. Governmental complex corridors that once resonated with his firm, booming footsteps now perceived the almost imperceptible shuffle of careful, halting steps. Protectors traversed unervingly closer, ready to steady their weakening master at the slightest stumble. The hands that once wielded the heavy war swords, or gestured sweeping commands across the map of the Fertile Crescent, now trembled visibly when signing royal directives. Even mighty lions grow frail and succumb to the inevitable chill when winter arrives. Yet his consciousness remained astonishingly sharp and commanding. Consultants still pursued his guidance, seeking the counsel of a mind sharpened by 5 decades of absolute rule. Designers presented ambitious plans for his indispensable endorsement. The dominion's vast apparatus continued turning efficiently under his observant, penetrating eye. Experience had rendered him wise. Suffering, particularly the public humiliation of his madness, had rendered him wise. Duration itself, the relentless passage of time, had rendered him tragically wise. Daniel, now an elderly individual himself with silver woven into his beard, still assisted in the hall, not merely as an administrator but as a confidant. Their relationship had deepened and softened through shared decades of extraordinary events. The Hebrew oracle who once interpreted bewildering visions now provided gentle comfort, a quiet presence to a dying sovereign. Peculiar, enduring friendships can indeed bloom in the most unlikely hostile soil. Potentially, in those final, low-voiced meetings, they communicated about those early, defining prophecies. The precious metal head, the magnificent, towering tree, the mysterious stone that crushes all kingdoms. They might have quietly reflected on how those visions had irrevocably configured both their intertwined existences. The interpreter and the visionary, a study in contrasts, bound together for life by enigmas revealed in moments of prophetic rest. The Queen Mother, a figure of enduring Babylonian strength, observed her offspring fade gently like the close of a long, brilliant dusk. She had witnessed him ascend from energetic prince to conquering emperor, from ruthless conqueror to raving madman, and finally to a humbled, yet still masterful, governor. Now she would observe him pass into whatever mysterious realm awaits departed sovereigns. Every maternal figure's offspring ultimately arrives home to rest. Mortality arrived quietly, anticlimactically, as it frequently does for the exhausted. A deep, final sleep. No dramatic, ultimate words survived in documentation. No earth-shattering deathbed prophecies resonate through history's chambers. Just silence settling over the precious governmental complex like fine, suffocating dust over ruins, marking the end of the Age of Gold. His body rested in state for days, laid out in the hall of procession. Citizens filed past in vast, hushed numbers to perceive their emperor one ultimate occasion. Some solemnly recalled his colossal construction initiatives that reshaped the world. Others whispered of his unrivaled military triumphs. A few, perhaps those who lived near the fields, might have recalled the peculiar, unsettling years when he vanished entirely from public perspective. All recognized, with a chilling certainty, that an era of unparalleled magnitude was concluding. The burial followed established Babylonian tradition. Royal remains rested in underground chambers, vast and sealed, surrounded by opulent treasures prepared for the afterlife passage. Precious metal cups, jeweled daggers, polished ivory furniture, immense wealth designed to ease the passage between realms. Yet mortality renders all earthly riches utterly meaningless, the final irony. Information of his passing extended along commercial routes like slow, widening ripples on still water. In Jerusalem, far to the west, some Hebrew displaced might have experienced profoundly complicated sentiments, a mixture of relief and unease. Their historical oppressor was gone, but likewise their powerful, stabilizing protector. His mortality transformed everything and nothing at once in the grand scheme of things. The governmental complex felt immediately and profoundly vacant without his overwhelming presence. Servants proceeded about their defined obligations, but the underlying energy had irrevocably shifted. Authority generates its own unique atmosphere, and when that absolute power departs, the atmosphere itself appears palpably different, thinner, colder. Chambers resonate differently when giants depart them. His offspring assembled immediately to discuss the inevitable succession. None possessed his unique, essential combination of towering intelligence, vaulting aspiration, and necessary ruthlessness. The throne would transfer, by custom, to the eldest, but everyone comprehended instantly that Babylon's precious era was already concluding. Some sovereigns simply cannot be replaced. The mold is broken upon their death. Outside the governmental complex apertures, the great Euphrates continued flowing inexorably toward the sea. The waterway had witnessed the ascent and the descent of numerous sovereigns, dynasties, and entire civilizations. It would flow long after Nebuchadnezzar's identity was forgotten by all except meticulous academics sifting through clay shards. Water recalls nothing and forgives everything, a patient, eternal witness. In the metropolis trading centers, nervous traders already murmured about what transformations might arrive next. Fresh governors bring fresh, often arbitrary policies, fresh favorites seeking enrichment, and fresh dangers. The commercial class that had prospered immensely under Nebuchadnezzar's iron stability questioned fearfully if their favorable fortune would violently cease. Uncertainty generates anxiety in every age and every market. As night descended over Babylon, celestial bodies appeared in their classical, unhurried configurations. The same constellations that had observed him crawl through the fields during his period of madness now gazed down impartially on his silent, interred form. Celestial witnesses to mortal drama, eternal and uncaring. They maintained their counsel to themselves. The magnificent sovereign's earthly chronicle had concluded, but chronicles once released into the world assume powerful existences of their own. Nebuchadnezzar would exist on in recollection, in prophecy, and in enduring legend. Mortality concludes the individual life but commences the myth. Aftermath, a fragile throne and a rapid decline. Evil Merodach assumed the heavy crown, a burden that felt excessively substantial for his lesser head and weaker character. Offspring of magnificent sovereigns frequently struggle immensely with inherited magnificence. The expectations prove suffocating. The darkness of the paternal figure descends lengthy and oppressively across the offspring's pathway. Babylon's fresh, untested governor would absorb this tragic truth rapidly and painfully. The identity itself transported enormous burden. Evil Merodach signified man of Marduk, deeply connecting him to Babylon's chief divine being and the city's identity. But divine identities cannot guarantee divine favor or skill in statecraft. The divine beings judge each governor separately, weighing actions without regard for bloodlines. Within a mere 2 years, his own opportunistic brother-in-law, Nebuchadnezzar, violently murdered him. Nebuchadnezzar seized authority through quick, decisive violence, as occurred frequently in classical governmental complexes where loyalty was a scarce commodity. Royal bloodline signifies little when sharper blades and ambitious conspirators determine succession. The coup unfolded rapidly and brutally. Babylon's established aristocrats, who had intensified restless under evil Merodach's uncertain, fumbling guidance, acquiesced. He utterly lacked his paternal figure's commanding, terrifying presence, his strategic consciousness, and his profound capacity to inspire both apprehension and fierce devotion simultaneously. Governmental complex intrigue immediately saturated the vacuum left by weak sovereignty. Nebuchadnezzar governed for 4 years before mortality claimed him too. Natural mortality this occasion, yet the kingdom trembled under the lack of firm leadership. His young offspring, Labashi Marduk, inherited the unstable throne at a perilous instant. Offspring render inadequate shields against aspiring, ruthless military commanders. The boy sovereign endured only months. Another coup, another swift, secret murder, another grasping claimant to Babylon's throne. Nabonidus emerged from the disorder, supported by ministers and aristocrats profoundly weary of instability and bloodshed. But even this choice, intended to restore order, would demonstrate inadequate to the monumental challenges ahead. Meanwhile, far to the western territories, a fresh, predatory authority was ascending and consolidating. Cyrus of Persia, the Achaemenid, had commenced his remarkable career of subjugation. His disciplined military forces moved like wildfire across the landscape, consuming kingdoms that had positioned themselves for generations. Babylon's duration of dominance was operating shortly. The dominion that Nebuchadnezzar constructed through iron will and strategic brilliance commenced fragmenting almost immediately after his death. Provincial administrators, sensing weakness at the center, declared independence. Tribute halted, ceasing to flow to the capital's coffers. Commercial routes shifted rapidly to avoid unstable, dangerous regions. Prosperity withered like flowers without sustaining water. Faith tensions added explosive fuel to the political disorder. Nabonidus favored the moon divine being Sin over Marduk, the established city god, deeply offending Babylon's established, powerful priesthood. He dedicated years in self-imposed Arabian displacement, leaving the capital to administer itself under the confused hand of a regent. Sacred festivals proceeded uncelebrated, disrupting the cosmological order. Sacred buildings descended into disrepair and neglect. Citizens recalled superior, more predictable days with deep longing. Elderly individuals in trading center squares mentioned Nebuchadnezzar's governance like a precious, unattainable aspiration. Entire affairs had been safer then, commerce more profitable and secure, the future more utterly certain. Nostalgia bloomed profusely in the barren soil of present difficulties and anxiety. The Hebrew displaced observed these unsettling developments with combined, complex sentiments. Babylon had been their imprisonment, the instrument of their catastrophe, but likewise their imposed, massive protection. Vulnerable governors might signify freedom, a potential return, but they could likewise signify vulnerability to alternative, crueler conquerors. Occasionally, the known adversary, you understand, demonstrates profoundly preferable to the approaching, unknown adversary. Daniel, now classical beyond all calculation, likely perceived the prophecies unfolding with tragic clarity. The precious metal head was visibly disintegrating, rendering pathway for the inferior silver torso and bronze abdomen. The magnificent, terrifying statue from Nebuchadnezzar's long-forgotten vision was revealing its genuine nature. Impressive from a distance, fragile and flawed when examined closely. Military commanders struggled desperately to preserve order with perpetually reduced resources. Warriors proceeded unpaid, their loyalties stretched thin. Fortifications proceeded unrepaired, stones crumbling along the mighty walls. Intelligence networks collapsed, leaving the state blind. The Dominion's nervous system was shutting down, slowly and surely, leaving the body vulnerable to inevitable assault. Economic decline followed political instability like a dark shadow. Traders actively avoided Babylon's unreliable trading centers, preferring safer, better-administered metropolitan areas elsewhere. Craftspeople immigrated to regions with superior prospects and stability. The population that remained intensified, growing poorer and desperately more restless. Urban deterioration extended like a creeping infection through the capital's once pristine districts. Foreign ambassadors noticed the transformations immediately. They reported back to their own sovereigns about Babylon's deepening vulnerability, about sudden opportunities for rapid expansion, about the distinct possibility of rich subjugations. Diplomatic marriages were swiftly cancelled, commercial agreements disregarded, and long-standing tribute payments withheld entirely. Yet the metropolis's physical grandeur, its stone face, remained largely intact. The Ishtar Gate still gleamed defiantly with its magnificent glazed brickwork. The hanging gardens, if they still existed, still bloomed in their isolated splendor. The governmental complex still impressed observers with its sheer magnitude and enduring splendor. But vacant, crumbling shells can appear spectacularly resilient from the outside. Some citizens maintained onto a desperate optimism. Potentially, a strong sovereign would yet emerge, someone who could restore the ancient, terrifying magnificence of Nebuchadnezzar's time. Potentially, the divine beings would still intervene, transmitting a champion to protect their beloved, sacred metropolis. Potentially, the present difficulties were just temporary storms before renewed sunshine and stability. But wise witnesses comprehended that the historical momentum had definitively shifted. Magnificent dominions ascend slowly over generations and descend abruptly in a single lifetime. Babylon's season of dominance was concluding, as all seasons must. The wheel of fortune was turning, inexorably lifting alternative populations, the Persians, while simultaneously lowering the once mighty Babylonians. In the governmental complex archives, meticulous administrators continued documenting continuous, dismal events. Their carefully inscribed clay tablets would survive longer than the unstable dynasty they assisted. Future archaeologists would piece together this detailed chronicle of decline from fragments and fractured lines. History preserves everything and nothing simultaneously. The precious era of gold had passed irrevocably. Silver durations were arriving, then bronze, then iron combined with clay, just as the vision had foretold decades earlier. Nebuchadnezzar's dominion was quickly becoming recollection. His accomplishments were turning into exaggerated legends. The magnificent sovereign's work was executed, but the chronicle he established in motion would continue unfolding for generations yet unborn. The narrative immediately establishes the foundational, enduring tension concerning humanity's orientation toward ultimate authority. Every successive generation finds itself positioned at a decisive juncture, compelled to choose between the glittering, immediate rewards of earthly dominion, the prideful assertion of self-will and temporal power, and the profound, quiet discipline of the celestial kingdom, necessitating a humble, deferential submission to a power far surpassing any mortal construct. The choice that tested Nebuchadnezzar within the meticulously cultivated confines of his governmental complex garden, whether to yield precedence to authorities greater than his imperial ego, remains the quintessential existential dilemma confronting the core of every mortal being. Babylon, in this context, becomes an eternal symbol, asking us whether we will prostrate ourselves before the magnificent, yet ultimately hollow, precious metal statue forged from our own ambitions, or whether we possess the spiritual clarity to lift our gaze skyward and perceive the nascent stone kingdom descending upon the clouds of paradise. In the annals of Islamic tradition, Nebuchadnezzar's identity underwent a fascinating transformation. His name, rendered in the Arabic tongue as Buktansar or Buktazer in some transliterations, shifted its phonetic structure while remarkably preserving the core elements of his chronicle and historical impact. Islamic scholars approached the Babylonian sovereign through a distinct theological and historical lens compared to the narratives prevalent in Jewish or Christian sources. Although the Quran itself maintains silence, never mentioning the king directly, subsequent Muslim academics diligently wove him into comprehensive narratives centered on themes of divine judgment, *Kata wa Qadar*, and stern prophetic caution. Early and influential Islamic historians, such as Al-Tabari, meticulously gathered diverse chronicles concerning classical rulers. Within these compilations, Nebuchadnezzar prominently appeared as a fearsome instrument of divine wrath deployed against the Israelites, chosen explicitly to discipline them for their consistent rejection of prophetic communications and covenants. This use of foreign rulers by Allah to correct wayward communities is a profound and familiar theme running across the entirety of monotheistic theology. The obliteration of Jerusalem, the holy city, carried extraordinary, profound significance within Islamic theological contemplation. Muslim academics articulated that the persistent rejection of the divine oracles by the Jewish communities led inexorably to severe divine discipline. Nebuchadnezzar, in this grand cosmic drama, became the unwitting, yet effective, servant of Allah's judgment. His successful subjugation of Judah served as a stark and undeniable demonstration of the devastating consequences following spiritual rebellion against the divine mandate. Intriguingly, some traditions offered a more sympathetic portrayal of the king. Confronted by the undeniable power of Daniel's luminous interpretations and the series of astonishing, miraculous indications, this undeniably pagan sovereign was eventually forced to recognize a transcendent divine truth. His subsequent descent into madness was thus interpreted simultaneously as a corrective discipline for his monumental pride and a necessary, difficult pathway toward genuine humility. His restoration was earned only through a full and public acknowledgement of Allah's absolute sovereignty over all earthly authority and governmental structures. Islamic versions of the Blazing Furnace Chronicle intensely magnified the core monotheistic themes. It emphasized how three faithful believers staunchly refused to revere false divine beings, even when faced with the immediate, horrific threat of execution. Their miraculous preservation from the consuming blaze powerfully demonstrated Allah's unwavering protection of his righteous, obedient servants. The sovereign's profound amazement and terror at this display ultimately guided him closer to a genuine spiritual conviction. Medieval Muslim chroniclers often positioned Nebuchadnezzar's reign within the broader cyclical configurations of ascent and decline among empires. His dominion perfectly exemplified the universal cycle described in the Quran. Allah grants authority to whom He wills, and removes it according to His eternal wisdom. The ultimate truth being that no earthly kingdom, regardless of its might, is intended to endure permanently. The legendary Hanging Gardens, assuming their historical reality, were viewed as superb examples of mortal ingenuity blessed and made possible by divine providence. Islamic scholars appreciated technical accomplishments that served to beautify and cultivate the earth, viewing such gardens as reflections of Jannah, paradise, glimpsed momentarily through mortal architecture and effort. Even pagan governors, when divinely inspired toward higher objectives, were capable of generating such magnificence. Sufi mystics, always seeking deeper, esoteric significances, discovered potent meaning in Nebuchadnezzar's madness. The sovereign's dramatic descent into a creature-like existence symbolized the necessary spiritual states experienced by serious seekers. The pursuit of divine understanding, *marifa*, requires that the ego and pride be utterly shattered, *fana*, before true enlightenment can enter the mortal vessel. Occasionally, Allah guides souls into a spiritual wilderness, a place of isolation, to impart vital lessons impossible to absorb amidst the distractions and luxuries of governmental palaces. His intricate relationship with the righteous prophet Daniel captivated generations of Islamic commentators. Here was the archetype: a pagan governor guided by a truthful oracle, a configuration that repeated throughout history as a model for communicating truth to power. Moses advised Pharaoh, Joseph assisted the Egyptian sovereigns, and Muhammad would later engage diplomatically with the Arabian tribes. Truth, in the Islamic perspective, is communicated to authority, often dramatically, across profound cultural and geographical boundaries. Some traditions confidently asserted that Nebuchadnezzar ultimately embraced monotheism fully, moving beyond mere recognition to genuine adherence. His later inscriptions, acknowledging a higher divine authority, were frequently interpreted as compelling evidence of a genuine, late-life conversion. The mad sovereign who had grazed like a beast became an enduring model of the repentant transgressor, ultimately restored to divine favor. Islamic scholars intensely debated whether pre-Islamic governors could achieve salvation through fitra, natural revelation, the innate human capacity to recognize God. Nebuchadnezzar's acknowledgement of the profound divine indications might qualify him for compassion, *Rama*, despite his lack of access to revealed scripture like the Quran. This acknowledged that Allah's judgment and mercy extended far beyond formal faith boundaries and established religious structures. The Babylonian displacement, while a tragedy, fulfilled significant objectives in Islamic historical contemplation. The Jewish dispersion from their homeland demonstrated the devastating consequences of covenant breaking, yet simultaneously served to extend monotheistic concepts and foundational spiritual ideas throughout the classical world. Divine discipline, therefore, was perceived to contain profound, concealed blessings. Persian Islamic traditions occasionally intertwined Nebuchadnezzar's chronicle with core Zoroastrian themes. The eternal confrontation between illumination, *Ahura Mazda*, and darkness, *Ahriman*, played out through the succession of earthly kingdoms. Babylon represented transient worldly authority that was destined to ultimately yield to superior spiritual authority. Material dominion inevitably surrenders its claim to eternal truth. Ottoman historians readily incorporated Nebuchadnezzar into their own sweeping imperial narratives. Turkish sultans viewed themselves as the legitimate successors to the grand traditions and accomplishments of classical Near Eastern civilizations. Babylon's grandeur was seen as a majestic foreshadowing of the comprehensive cultural and architectural achievements of Islamic civilization. Past magnificence served to justify present imperial aspirations and dominion. Modern Islamic commentators occasionally invoke the figure of Nebuchadnezzar when engaging in critiques of Western political and economic authority. Much like classical Babylon, contemporary global dominions may appear dazzling and spectacular, yet they often harbor the seeds and internal structural weaknesses destined for their own obliteration. Pride unfailingly leads to downfall, irrespective of military strength or economic prowess. History, these scholars argue, repeats these eternal configurations of power and morality. Some Muslim academics highlight fascinating environmental themes embedded within the sovereign's chronicle. His radical transformation into a creature-like state represents humanity's required proper relationship with nature, a recognition that mortal arrogance fundamentally disrupts cosmic harmony. True restoration demands the acknowledgement of humanity's designated position within creation, rather than presuming a place above it. The 7 years of madness thus became a potent metaphor for intense spiritual passages in Sufi literature. Seekers might dedicate years in states of apparent unreason or isolation, known as khalwa or retreat, while profound divine wisdom secretly operates within their souls. What initially appeared to be a debilitating breakdown was, in reality, a genuine breakthrough to a higher, more essential consciousness. Allah's profound methods consistently surpass the limitations of mortal comprehension. Islamic artistic expression rarely depicted Nebuchadnezzar directly, adhering to the general reluctance to portray mortal, historical figures in sacred or faith-based contexts. However, architectural traditions unconsciously preserved lasting Babylonian influences. Gardens, formal courtyards, and sophisticated decorative geometric configurations carried forward aesthetic principles initially developed and perfected in classical Mesopotamia. Contemporary Muslim exegetes continue to discover contemporary, urgent relevance in Nebuchadnezzar's chronicle. Modern leaders who arrogantly assert divine authority for themselves or demand outright reverence from their citizens are merely repeating classical, catastrophic errors. Authority invariably corrupts unless it is rigorously balanced by the constant recognition and submission to a transcendent, higher authority. The sovereign's traumatic madness serves as a timeless caution against megalomaniacal tendencies and imperial overreach. The universality of the narrative powerfully appeals to deeply held Islamic theological sensibilities. Truth, they assert, transcends cultural, geographical, and chronological boundaries. Divine judgment operates through historical processes that cycle and repeat across all civilizations. What ultimately happened to Babylon stands as a perpetual warning, capable of happening to any dominion that willfully disregards its fundamental dependence upon Allah. In summation, Islamic custom profoundly transformed Nebuchadnezzar from a mere foreign conqueror into a powerful spiritual exemplar. His journey from self-assured pride, through punishing madness, to redemptive humility illustrated the spiritual pathways all souls must inevitably travel. The Babylonian sovereign became a universal symbol of mortal capacity for both profound corruption and spectacular redemption. His chronicle merged seamlessly with broader Islamic themes concerning divine sovereignty, necessary prophetic caution, and the ultimately transitory nature of all worldly authority. The image of the mad sovereign grazing beneath the celestial bodies demonstrated truths that transcend specific faith boundaries, lessons inscribed directly into the mortal core, regardless of specific cultural context. The archaeology of Babylon offered a stark contrast to the legends. Nothing but dust and fractured brick. That was the desolate scene German archaeologist Robert Koldewey encountered when he began his methodical excavation work in 1899. Generations of relentless wind, scouring desert sand, and seasonal rain had effectively buried the magnificent structures of Nebuchadnezzar's reign beneath colossal elevations of accumulated earth. Yet, the patient scientific spades of Koldewey's team would slowly, meticulously resurrect the sovereign's greatest architectural accomplishments from their deep earthen grave. The initial discoveries felt genuinely miraculous to the diggers. Glazed brick fragments emerged in brilliant azure and deep yellow pigments, their colors astonishingly bright, as vivid as the day Babylonian craftspeople had fired them in their kilns centuries ago. Reliefs of stylized lions, fearsome dragons, ****, and powerful bulls paraded across the ceramic surfaces in endless, perpetual processions. The majestic Ishtar Gateway was finally awakening from its prolonged, silent rest. Koldewey's assembly of workers operated diligently for 18 intensive years, uncovering layer after meticulous layer of the classical civilization. They discovered Nebuchadnezzar's identity stamped directly into countless hundreds of bricks, his royal signature scattered throughout the ruins like the calling cards of a ruler from the remote, silent past. "I am Nebuchadnezzar, sovereign of Babylon." The inscriptions boldly declared to archaeologists who would be born millennia after his death. The immense governmental complex sprawled across acres of excavated ground, forming a vast royal acropolis. Chamber after chamber revealed undeniable evidence of unimaginable royal splendor and meticulous planning. They unearthed the throne halls where the sovereign once received foreign ambassadors bearing rich tribute, and private chambers designed for rest, contemplation, or perhaps where he experienced his terrifying visions. Large courtyards were uncovered, spaces where he might have stood, proclaiming his own greatness before the sudden onset of his divine madness. Crucially, the search for the Hanging Gardens continued. Coldway pursued the fabled wonder of the world desperately. He uncovered what he tentatively theorized might be their foundation. Colossal masonry arches engineered to support stepped, heavily planted gardens, alongside carefully positioned pipes for comprehensive irrigation, chambers designed to house the necessary pumps, and deep, vaulted spaces intended for expansive root systems. Yet, absolute certainty concerning the garden's location or existence remained elusive. The magnificent ceremonial pathway, or processional way, extended before the excavators like a royal carpet composed of perfectly laid masonry. Glazed brick lions prowled in low relief along the fortifications, 60 magnificent ceramic hunters on each side, guarding the sacred path to Babylon's inner core. Nebuchadnezzar's own feet had repeatedly traversed this very route, perhaps on his way to supervise the construction of the infamous precious metal statue. Cuneiform tablets turned up by the thousands. The royal archives, preserved indelibly on clay, revealed the mundane, complex administrative details of the massive empire. Records of grain shipments, levy documentation, and military dispatches detailing troop movements. Among these bureaucratic documents, provision lists were discovered explicitly mentioning Jehoiakim, the captive sovereign of Judah, thereby definitively confirming the scriptural accounts of the Hebrew displacement and exile. Each unearthed brick recounted vivid chronicles to those scholars who possessed the knowledge to interpret its chemical signature and form. Chemical analysis revealed precisely where the clay was extracted, how the kilns were fired, and what mineral glazes were utilized. Nebuchadnezzar's immense construction initiatives transformed into forensic puzzles, meticulously resolved through the precision of scientific archaeology. The reconstructed Ishtar Gateway proved to be the most spectacular accomplishment. 8 staggering rows of alternating bulls and dragons, executed in vibrant relief, decorated the monumental entrance to Babylon's inner metropolis. Each creature was unique, the meticulous craftspeople having varied minute details to prevent any sense of visual monotony. Modern observers today gasp at the pigments, miraculously preserved for over 2 millennia beneath the protective earth. Later expeditions continued to add missing portions to the immense puzzle. Saddam Hussein's archaeologists, during the 1970s and 80s, successfully uncovered additional governmental complex sections before conflict tragically interrupted their essential operations. Every excavation season brought increased comprehension of Babylon's classical grandeur. Carbon dating positioned the major construction phases firmly within the parameters of Nebuchadnezzar's long governance. The archaeological evidence matched historical documentation with remarkable, precise accuracy. This was genuinely the Babylon of Daniel's apocalyptic visions, the metropolis of the Hebrew displacement, and the ultimate symbol of imperial aspiration carved forever in masonry and brick. Botanical remains told crucial environmental chronicles. Archaeologists discovered traces of exotic plant species brought from remote provinces, clear evidence of royal gardens, even if not definitively the legendary Hanging Gardens themselves. Nebuchadnezzar had genuinely cultivated verdant, thriving spaces in his harsh desert capital. The sophisticated water systems revealed an engineering genius that rivals modern capabilities, utilizing channels, immense reservoirs, and complex pumps to move precious water throughout the vast metropolis. Classical hydraulic designers had truly been master craftspeople. German museums became the primary repositories for Babylon's most spectacular treasures. The Pergamon Museum in Berlin meticulously reconstructed the Ishtar Gateway and the ceremonial pathway, utilizing the original glazed bricks shipped from Iraq. Visitors today can traverse the same route Nebuchadnezzar once traveled, albeit in a profoundly different cultural and chronological context. Iraqi archaeologists continued excavations after independence, often concentrating on residential districts, workshops, and trading centers previously unexplored by earlier foreign expeditions. These findings revealed how ordinary Babylonians existed while their sovereign constructed monumental projects dedicated to his own magnificence. Satellite imagery in recent decades has dramatically revealed the complete extent of classical Babylon. From space, the clear outline of fortifications, thoroughfares, and colossal structures appears clearly despite deep surface burial. Modern technology allows us to perceive what ground-level excavation inevitably overlooked. Chemical analysis of glass fragments indicated advanced metallurgy. Babylonian craftspeople possessed secrets of alloys and glazes that produced pigments impossible to accomplish with simple approaches. The sovereign's artisans were creative individuals and applied scientists combined. Inscription analysis revealed a gradual, telling evolution in Nebuchadnezzar's royal titles over the span of his reign. Early texts displayed confident, almost arrogant, assertions of unquestioned divine approval. Later inscriptions sounded noticeably more humble, potentially reflecting the profound impact of his years of divinely inflicted madness. Even the royal propaganda eventually reflected a degree of personal transformation. Yet, the absence of evidence occasionally communicated as loudly as the discoveries themselves. No traces of the mythical Hanging Gardens have ever been definitively located despite intensive searching. Furthermore, there is no administrative documentation of a 7-year royal absence despite the existence of detailed administrative archives. Archaeology constantly reminds scholars that classical sources do not always recount the complete, unvarnished chronicle. Recent conflicts have severely threatened Babylon's fragile ruins. Bombing, rampant looting, and the establishment of military installations have damaged locations that survived millennia of natural erosion. Modern warfare poses a far greater danger to classical heritage than generations of natural processes. Current Iraqi authorities, operating with international organizations, strive desperately to preserve what precious material remains. Three-dimensional scanning technology generates permanent documentation of endangered structures. Digital reconstruction might tragically be the only method future generations will truly experience Babylon's magnificence. Climate transformation adds a fresh, terrifying urgency to archaeological operations. Rising water tables threaten buried remains with unprecedented water damage. Salt crystallization fractures the classical bricks as moisture configurations shift in the soil. Time is operating shortly for a complete, comprehensive excavation. Yet, each season continues to bring fresh, compelling discoveries. Recent excavations have uncovered administrative structures, religious faith complexes, and previously unknown residential areas that expand comprehension of Nebuchadnezzar's vast metropolis. The classical sovereign still possesses secrets to reveal to patient, dedicated academics. In the conclusion, archaeology successfully transforms Nebuchadnezzar from a shadowy, legendary figure into a tangible flesh-and-blood governor. His fingerprints remain pressed into the ancient clay bricks. His singular visions are literally carved into the masonry fortifications. His imperial aspirations are mapped across acres of desolate ruins. The spade reveals what chronicles only hinted at: the complete scope of one individual's relentless determination to leave permanent, undeniable marks upon the face of the earth. Saddam Hussein and the revival of Nebuchadnezzar. The modern dictator deliberately positioned himself among the classical ruins, boldly conceiving himself as the destined successor to Babylonian magnificence. Saddam Hussein gazed across the excavated foundations where Nebuchadnezzar once governed, perceiving not a mere archaeological location, but a living blueprint for modern, absolute dominion. The powerful past would be pressed into service to assist the present regime's aspirations. In 1978, the grandiose reconstruction project commenced. Iraqi laborers combined freshly manufactured bricks using classical methodologies, stamping them with inscriptions that pointedly alternated between Nebuchadnezzar's identity and Saddam's own name. This structure was built by Nebuchadnezzar, offspring of Nabopolassar, sovereign of Babylon, followed immediately by. This was reconstructed by Saddam Hussein, offspring of Nebuchadnezzar, president of Iraq. The parallel was not only intentional, it was complete and absolute. Both individuals ruled from the Fertile Crescent of Mesopotamia. Both directed vast, ambitious territories. Both constructed monumental structures dedicated to their own magnificent egos. Both demanded absolute, unquestioning devotion from their subjects. Both asserted a divine mandate or historical necessity for their earthly authority. History, under the direction of Saddam, was consciously repeating itself with modern, terrifying variations. Saddam's designers meticulously examined classical plans preserved in masonry and clay. Governmental complex fortifications dramatically ascended upon Nebuchadnezzar's original foundations. Throne chambers appeared where classical sovereigns once held court. Gardens began to bloom where the legendary hanging gardens might have once prospered. The long-deceased metropolis was dramatically awakened into a calculated, artificial existence. Tourism became a strategic political declaration. Visitors traversed the reconstructed ceremonial pathways, lined with restored lion reliefs. They ascended monumental stairs to the governmental complex's stepped levels overlooking the vast Euphrates River. They paused for photographs beside the fortifications where Saddam's identity was literally fused alongside Nebuchadnezzar's. Classical legitimacy was thereby engineered to bless modern dictatorship. The comparison extended far deeper than mere architecture. Both governors confronted powerful coalition adversaries. Nebuchadnezzar battled Assyrians, Egyptians, and rebellious vassal states. Saddam battled Iranians, Kurds, and ultimately American-led forces. Both perceived themselves as the essential defenders of Mesopotamian civilization against persistent foreign dangers and threats. Cultural festivals were inaugurated specifically to celebrate Babylonian heritage. Musicians performed on reconstructed ancient instruments. Artisans recreated classical crafts. Academics lectured widely about Mesopotamian accomplishments. All these efforts supported Saddam's encompassing narrative of historical continuity, stretching from the grand classical sovereigns directly to the modern presidency. The destructive Iran-Iraq conflict provided the perfect backdrop for these historical assertions. Like Nebuchadnezzar defending Babylon against historical Elamite invasions, Saddam portrayed himself as the vital guardian of Arab civilization against perceived Persian aggression. Classical adversaries were consciously recast as modern confrontations. Oil wealth provided the massive funding for these grandiose construction initiatives, reminiscent of Nebuchadnezzar's original construction programs. New governmental complexes, colossal monuments, and public works proclaimed Iraqi authority to both domestic audiences and foreign observers. Petrochemical revenues effectively replaced tribute traditionally collected from conquered provinces. Educational curricula placed heavy emphasis on Mesopotamian history. Schoolchildren learned extensively about Babylon's magnificent days, consciously connecting classical accomplishments to contemporary Iraqi national identity. Nebuchadnezzar was elevated to the status of a national hero, whose ancient inheritance supposedly justified present-day authoritarianism. Even Saddam's personal mythology resonated strongly with Babylonian themes. Like Nebuchadnezzar, he asserted divine prophecies and a special, unique destiny. Court poets composed eloquent verses comparing him to the classical sovereigns. Official state media portrayed him as the selected instrument of historical necessity, guiding the nation toward a promised glorious future. The First Gulf conflict tragically interrupted these grandiose plans. Coalition bombing damaged reconstruction initiatives, and international sanctions prevented the completion of planned monuments. Saddam's Neo-Babylon remained perpetually unfinished, a constant characteristic of numerous dictatorial aspirations. Archaeological locations were swiftly transformed into military installations. During subsequent conflicts, American forces established extensive camps among the classical ruins. Helicopters landed heavily on the ancient ceremonial pathways. Soldiers traversed the routes where Nebuchadnezzar once paraded. Modern warfare relentlessly trampled historical preservation. The 2003 invasion definitively concluded Saddam's Neo-Babylonian revival. Coalition forces discovered his reconstructed governmental complexes and seized his archaeological propaganda. The modern sovereign who had so fiercely asserted Nebuchadnezzar's mantle was ignominiously pulled from an excavation in the ground, disheveled, defeated, and utterly stripped of his adopted grandeur. Looting immediately followed the regime's collapse. classical artifacts disappeared rapidly from museums and archaeological locations. Black market dealers quickly distributed Mesopotamian treasures to private collectors worldwide. Conflicts scattered Babylon's heritage across the entire globe. International efforts immediately commenced to assess the extensive damage and prevent further catastrophic losses. UNESCO listed Babylon as an endangered World Heritage location. Emergency conservation operations were initiated to stabilize structures threatened by neglect and ongoing conflict. The irony of the situation was profound. Saddam's identification with Nebuchadnezzar had, paradoxically, attracted international concentration and funding to Mesopotamian archaeology. His reconstruction initiatives, however politically motivated, had preserved classical building approaches and trained a fresh generation of Iraqi craftspeople. Yet, his militaristic approach to historical inheritance ultimately obliterated more than it preserved. Conflicts fought over Babylon's identity brought tanks to its gateways and hostile warriors to its ruins. The past became a devastating casualty of present conflicts. Modern Iraq still grapples with this intricate, difficult heritage. Babylon continues to attract tourists interested in both classical history and recent political symbolism. Saddam's reconstructions remain a challenging portion of the archaeological landscape, raising complex questions about authenticity and preservation ethics. Some academics argue that Saddam's construction initiatives, despite their obvious political motivations, followed legitimate, if heavy-handed, archaeological practices. Others condemn them as historical vandalism that deliberately confused authentic ruins with modern political propaganda. The debate continues fiercely among heritage professionals. Local communities recall both the classical sovereign and the modern dictator with combined, conflicting sentiments. Nebuchadnezzar built their metropolis, but also violently obliterated Jerusalem. Saddam funded reconstruction, but also initiated wars that devastated the entire region. Historical figures consistently resist simple moral categorization. Current Iraqi authorities actively pursue to reclaim Babylon from both classical and modern political associations. They emphasize its fundamental significance to world civilization rather than serving any particular political regime. Universal heritage, they assert, transcends territorial boundaries and ephemeral political systems. The location now functions primarily as a museum and research center focused on Mesopotamian civilization's vast contributions to human development. Cuneiform inscription, legal codes, astronomical observations, and architectural innovations. These accomplishments belong to all humanity. Yet, the darkness and ambition of both sovereigns still lingers over Babylon's ruins. Nebuchadnezzar's bricks still undeniably bear his identity. Saddam's reconstruction still configures observer experiences. The past stubbornly refuses to remain fully buried beneath sand and time. Perhaps that outcome is fitting. Babylon has perpetually been a metropolis of layered significances. A classical metropolis, a scriptural symbol, an archaeological treasure, and a modern political instrument. Each generation discovers fresh, relevant significance in its ruins. The masonry communicates different, evolving languages to different interpreters. In the final conclusion, both Nebuchadnezzar and Saddam demonstrated the very same, inescapable truth. Earthly authority can construct unimaginably impressive monuments, but it cannot guarantee an enduring legacy. Wind and conflict ultimately scatter even the mightiest accomplishments. Only the chronicles truly survive, passed from generation to generation, assembling fresh significances with each recounting. The creature and the head of precious metal. Symbolism across duration. Creative individuals have painted him in countless, conflicting forms across the generations. Sometimes he appears as the spectacular sovereign enthroned upon a precious metal dais, crowned with jewels that capture the shimmering candlelight in medieval manuscripts. Other times he is depicted as the creature, down on hands and knees, his hair wild and matted like a lion's mane, his fingernails hardened and elongated like an eagle's talons. The same singular individual, perceived through vastly different eyes, recounts profoundly different truths about the human condition. Renaissance painters particularly loved the stark contrast. Nebuchadnezzar's transformation from imperial governor to feral creature provided a perfect, dramatic subject for exploring the dual, complex aspects of mortal nature, the tension between the civilized self and the animalistic core. Flemish masters painted elaborate governmental complex scenes displaying the sovereign's overwhelming magnificence, then paired them with haunting, desolate images of his madness unfolding in dark, primeval forests. William Blake's famous print captured the agonizing instant of transformation. The sovereign crouches naked among jagged rocks, his mortal form dissolving into something creature-like, yet still retaining profound traces of a regal demeanor in his posture. Hair streams down his back like a grotesque waterfall. His eyes stare with a troubling combination of deep madness and the sudden dawning of agonizing spiritual comprehension. Medieval illuminated manuscripts portrayed the statue from his terrifying, forgotten vision. The precious metal head often gleamed with actual gold leaf applied patiently by dedicated monks, a dazzling symbol of Babylon's fleeting dominance. The silver torso, the bronze abdomen, the iron legs, and the clay feet. Each section was meticulously painted to represent the succession of earthly kingdoms that would inevitably ascend and descend according to the rigid divine plan. Theological treatises consistently utilized Nebuchadnezzar as the ultimate, powerful example of pride's inevitable discipline. Church paternal figures inscribed lengthy, dense commentaries explaining how his chronicle demonstrated the deity's absolute, unwavering sovereignty over all earthly governors and tyrannical systems. The sovereign became an essential educational instrument for spiritual instruction across countless generations. Dante Alighieri positioned him specifically in the lowest ring of the Inferno, frozen immovably in ice, serving eternal discipline for his profound pride and his brutal violence toward God's chosen people. The poet's powerful conception transformed the Babylonian governor into an eternal symbol of tyrannical authority, justly receiving its deserved discipline. ****. Literature thus rendered him immortal in ways he had never intended nor desired. Protestant reformers discovered fresh, powerful significances in the classical symbols. The precious metal head, in their interpretation, represented the established papal authority, which they prophesied would be utterly crushed by the stone kingdom of Reformed Christianity. Nebuchadnezzar's statue became a detailed map of church history leading directly to their own era of theological purification and rebellion. Political cartoonists across generations have utilized Nebuchadnezzar's imagery to critique contemporary governors. Sovereigns who asserted divine authority discovered themselves mercilessly depicted as the mad Babylonian monarch grazing bestially in fields. The potent symbol crossed cultural boundaries, communicating universal themes of authority, megalomania, and inevitable hubris. Opera composers generated dramatic, sweeping works based on his chronicle. Giuseppe Verdi's Nabucco, Italian for Nebuchadnezzar, transformed the Hebrew displacement into a stirring, politically charged musical drama. The famous chorus, Va Pensiero, chorus of the Hebrew slaves, quickly became an unofficial anthem of burgeoning Italian nationalism and the longing for liberation. Classical Babylon thus aided modern political aspirations through the profound, unifying authority of music. Romantic poets discovered deep inspiration in his transformation. The theme of reason surrendered and eventually recovered, of civilization stripped away to reveal primal humanity, resonated deeply with their intense exploration of the unconscious mind, consciousness, and madness. Nebuchadnezzar became a prototype for their tortured creative heroes, figures whose genius was inextricably linked to their personal unraveling. American preachers, notably during the seismic religious upheaval of the Great Awakening, seized upon Nebuchadnezzar's vivid chronicle. They utilized his fall to deliver scorching sermons, cautioning their congregations against the blinding hubris of pride and the corrosive snare of materialism. The swift, total downfall of the sovereign vividly demonstrated how rapidly earthly achievement, no matter how monumental, could utterly vanish. Yet, his eventual restoration, a moment of profound spiritual reversal, displayed the boundless compassion readily available to repentant transgressors, regardless of the magnitude of their previous sins. Colonial-era political writers and philosophers frequently invoked the statue's potent symbolism when attempting to characterize the decadent European dominions. They argued that Britain's vaunted imperial authority was merely iron combined with brittle clay, outwardly formidable, yet inherently containing the foundational weaknesses that would lead to its own dissolution. The prophesied Stone Kingdom, in this revolutionary interpretation, would manifest as the democratic republics founded upon principles of natural regulation and inherent human rights. Victorian archaeologists, who descended upon the newly uncovered ruins of Babylon, were driven by romantic, even zealous notions of discovering the genuine, verifiable locations of scriptural events. Every spadeful of earth, every inscription unearthed, was meticulously interpreted through the lens of Nebuchadnezzar's compelling personal chronicle. In this environment, the nascent field of science served not to challenge, but rather to confirm and solidify customary religious narratives. Later, 20th-century dictators, seemingly unaware of the ancient parallels, unconsciously repeated Nebuchadnezzar's configuration of megalomaniacal power. Hitler's promised thousand-year Reich, Stalin's fabricated communist paradise, Mao's devastating cultural revolution. All audaciously asserted the creation of a permanent, irreversible transformation of mortal civilization, and all inevitably concluded in the same tragic dust and catastrophic, fractured promises. Psychological interpreters found fresh, profound significances within the monarch's temporary madness. Freudian analysts perceived the collapse as a terrifying breakdown of rigid ego defenses, a terrifying return to primal impulse. Jungian academics interpreted it as an archetypal, inescapable passage through the collective unconscious, a descent into the shadow of humanity. Modern therapy approaches still draw instructional insights from this classical case examination of spiritual and mental collapse. During the tense years of the Cold War, propagandists utilized Babylonian imagery to effectively characterize opposing ideologies. Each superpower portrayed itself as the righteous Stone Kingdom, utterly destined to crush the opposing faction's false dominion. Nuclear weaponry, waiting silently in silos, became the terrible, consuming blaze that would annihilate the fourth creature, the final corrupt empire. Contemporary environmental movements discovered resonant ecological communications within Nebuchadnezzar's transformation. His profound, unsettling restoration to a creature state was seen as representing humanity's urgent requirement to reconnect physically and spiritually with nature. They argued that modern civilization's rampant pride was leading directly to an environmental madness, a disconnect that only genuine, radical humility could effectively remedy. The creative individuals of the digital age generated fresh, hyper-realistic interpretations utilizing complex computer graphics and immersive virtual reality. Interactive installations permitted observers to experience the sovereign's traumatic transformation from their own intimate, first-person perspective. Classical symbols thus found dynamic, cutting-edge expression through sophisticated new technology. Prosperity gospel preachers often heavily emphasized Nebuchadnezzar's restoration to wealth and complete authority following his humbling period. They taught that the divine being desired actively to bless faithful believers with material achievement and abundance, provided they preserved proper attitudes of faith and obedience. The sovereign's dramatic recovery became a potent promise for contemporary believers seeking financial favor. Meanwhile, academic historians diligently attempted to separate the accretion of symbolic interpretations from verifiable historical evidence. They meticulously examined Nebuchadnezzar strictly as a political figure operating within his own specific Mesopotamian cultural context, rather than viewing him as a timeless spiritual archetype. Yet, even the most rigorous scholarly analysis found it impossible to completely escape the pervasive authority of the accumulated, millennia-old symbolism. Interfaith dialogue discovered common ground in Nebuchadnezzar's chronicle. Jews, Christians, and Muslims all recognized him as a figure of global importance who ultimately acknowledged the supremacy of divine authority. His passage from overwhelming pride to genuine humility provided a shared spiritual wisdom that transcended traditional faith boundaries. Popular culture continually discovered fresh, exciting utilizations for Babylonian imagery. Movies centered on classical dominions featured Nebuchadnezzar as an intricate, flawed character, occasionally an outright villain, often a tragic, magnificent hero. Video games permitted participants the opportunity to construct their own immense, virtual versions of classical Babylon. Modern Iraq struggled publicly with the sovereign's complex, dual inheritance. He was simultaneously the feared obliterator of the Jewish sacred building and the glorious constructor of unparalleled architectural wonders. Tourist guides today must navigate carefully between established historical facts and profound faith sensitivities when recounting his chronicle to diverse international audiences. The symbolism demonstrated itself to be remarkably, almost miraculously, adaptable. Each successive generation discovered highly contemporary relevance in these classical images. The precious metal head represented whatever earthly authority currently appeared most dominant and impressive. The terrifying creature represented whatever profound madness or social collapse most threatened civilization at that moment. The stone kingdom embodied whatever necessary optimism or revolutionary hope appeared most urgent. Potentially, that very inherent adaptability fully explains the enduring authority and power of Nebuchadnezzar's chronicle. It contained enough fundamental, archetypal elements to communicate effectively across vast cultural boundaries and expansive historical periods. The sovereign's deeply personal passage, from pride through the crucible of madness to eventual, hard-won wisdom, resonated with universal mortal experiences. In the final estimation, the creature and the head of precious metal became a profound mirror for human nature itself. We all intrinsically contain the capacity for both stunning magnificence and debilitating madness, for constructing shimmering, precious metal dominions, and for crawling helplessly through the grass like mere beasts. Nebuchadnezzar's agonizing transformation served as a chilling reminder to each generation that the distance separating magnificence from utter disgrace is far shorter than pride can ever conceive. Final meditations. Pride, authority, and prophecy. The celestial bodies gazed down that desolate night upon a shattered sovereign, his wild hair hopelessly matted with heavy dew, his broken fingernails perpetually caked with the cold earth. The once mighty governor now crawled through the governmental complex gardens on his hands and knees. 7 long, silent years had passed since reasoning had first departed him. 7 brutal years of consuming grass like common livestock, of resting exposed under the open atmosphere, of being violently driven out from human civilization. What agonizing contemplations moved through his clouded, broken consciousness? Did any vestige of memory recall the towering precious metal statue, the blazing furnace, the fearful visions that Daniel had so wisely interpreted? Did some buried portion of him instinctively comprehend that this brutal, profound humbling assisted divine objectives that stretched far beyond his mortal comprehension? Or was awareness itself simply too substantial, an impossible burden for madness to transport? The hall administrators murmured anxiously behind the formidable governmental complex fortifications. How much longer could they possibly preserve the elaborate fiction of the king's royal presence? Commercial agreements required crucial signing. Military campaigns demanded decisive guidance. Provincial administrators insisted upon receiving clear direction. The entire dominion functioned utterly on the assumption of centralized, unquestioned authority. What happened when that supreme source of authority was merely grazing in the private gardens like a beast? Perhaps his closest, most trusted consultants desperately covered for him. Perhaps they boldly forged his seal on necessary documents, issued crucial directives in his identity. They had to preserve the external apparatus of authority while its actual source wandered, utterly surrendered within his own consciousness. Administration has perpetually been a grand theater, demanding actors to perform their vital roles even when the lead performer has utterly forgotten his lines. Daniel matured into a venerable elderly man during those strange, silent years. The Hebrew oracle who had interpreted so numerous royal visions now observed their fulfillment in the most literal, agonizing manner possible. The magnificent tree of the king's power had been cut down just as the prophecy predicted. The stump remained, however, bound tightly with iron and bronze, patiently waiting for paradise's destined restoration. In Jerusalem's decimated ruins, the displaced exiles perceived faint, distant murmurs of their captor's destiny. Some might have experienced a grim, righteous satisfaction. Divine judgment was finally operating itself out in the governmental complex gardens far from their obliterated sacred building. Others perhaps experienced a quiet pity. Even adversaries, they might have mused, deserved compassion when the unyielding judgment of paradise descended upon them. The 7th year concluded as suddenly and unexpectedly as the madness had commenced. Nebuchadnezzar slowly lifted his vacant eyes to paradise, and reasoning flooded back, restored like a sudden sunrise after perpetual night. He positioned himself upright on mortal legs, spoke with a clear mortal voice, contemplated once again with a lucid mortal consciousness. The creature became an individual again, but fundamentally not the same individual who had first descended. His initial, immediate act was one of profound reverence, not of Marduk or any familiar Babylonian deity, but of the most high divine being who governs over all mortal kingdoms. The sovereign who had once arrogantly demanded universal reverence now humbly offered it to authorities far beyond any earthly throne. Pride had been completely incinerated away, leaving genuine humility firmly in its position. The restoration was as complete and total as the humbling had been catastrophic. Aristocrats and counselors welcomed him back with palpable relief and absolute wonder. His dominion was fully restored. His majesty was powerfully reestablished. His kingdom was immediately reinstated. But the individual who resumed the throne was irrevocably changed from the individual who had departed it. His later inscriptions reflect this profound transformation. Gone were the boastful, arrogant assertions of divine status and eternal power. Instead, there was a clear acknowledgement of higher, eternal authorities, deep gratitude for the compassions received, and stark warnings about the persistent dangers of pride. The mad sovereign had absorbed critical instructions that sane sovereigns frequently overlook. What did he actually recall of those 7 surrendered years? Did he remember the horrifying experience of madness? Or was it mercifully erased from recollection? Did he comprehend his extreme suffering as discipline, purification, or perhaps both? The historical documentation preserves his spectacular restoration, but not his intimate reflections on the agonizing passage that led there. The dominion he resumed was different, too. 7 years of uncertain guidance had significantly weakened central authority. Provincial administrators had intensified their sense of accustomed independence. Commercial partners had discovered necessary alternate arrangements and trade routes. The external apparatus of authority had continued functioning, yes, but with substantially reduced proficiency and increased, dangerous fragmentation. Yet something profoundly valuable had been gained through this surrender. The sovereign's public humbling had demonstrated vital truths that no quantity of military subjugation could ever teach. Mortal authority remains fundamentally provisional, entirely dependent on forces far beyond political control. Even absolute monarchs ultimately answer to absolute authority. Daniel's prophecies assumed fresh, undeniable credibility after their literal fulfillment. Governmental complex administrators who had previously dismissed Hebrew wisdom as mere foreign superstition now recognized its terrifying accuracy. The elderly oracle's interpretations had demonstrated themselves more reliable than all the centuries of Babylonian astrology or vision manuals combined. The chronicle extended far beyond the governmental complex fortifications, transported by shrewd traders and diplomats to remote, far-flung kingdoms. Information of the mad sovereign's restoration traveled quickly along ancient commercial routes, inspiring universal awe and profound wonder. Here was undeniable evidence that divine judgment operated itself out through the very fabric of mortal history, that pride inescapably preceded descent, and that compassion followed even the most severe judgment. Future generations would endlessly wrestle with the account's deep significance. Was Nebuchadnezzar a victim or a willing volunteer in his own catastrophic downfall? Did his overwhelming pride necessitate direct divine intervention? Or did divine objective simply demand his complete humbling? The complex intersection of mortal selection and celestial sovereignty remained, and remains, perpetually mysterious. The sovereign's transformation became the enduring template for comprehending political authority itself. All earthly authority exists by divine permission, and is subject always to divine judgment. Governors who willfully disregard this fundamental truth risk surrendering not just their thrones, but their very sanity. The crown that appears so outwardly secure can quickly become a burden too substantial for mortal consciousness to safely bear. His chronicle likewise provided robust optimism to all those who had severely descended from great elevations of achievement. Recovery was possible, restoration available, redemption perpetually within reach. The creature sovereign who had crawled through the grass had miraculously regained his throne. No descent was excessively complete for divine compassion to reverse entirely. In the conclusion, Nebuchadnezzar's spectacular passage, from precious governmental complex to grassy field and miraculously back again, illustrated timeless, core truths about mortal nature. We are all equally capable of spectacular accomplishment and creature-like degradation, sometimes within the very same lifetime. Authority inherently corrupts unless perpetually balanced by humility. Pride precedes obliteration, but grace can fully reconstruct what judgment mercilessly tears down. The celestial bodies that had observed him crawl wretchedly through the gardens likewise observed him resume his throne with new gravitas. They had perceived both impossible extremes of mortal experience performed out within one individual's existence. From their eternal perspective, potentially, sovereigns and creatures appeared equally small, equally dependent on forces far beyond themselves. The magnificent sovereign's earthly chronicle was concluding, but its spiritual significance was just commencing its eternal journey. Nebuchadnezzar would live on in prophecy and symbol, in cautionary tale and sacred promise, in the collective recollection of populations who comprehended that even the mightiest governors remain accountable to authorities they cannot possibly control. As he aged upon his restored throne, did he occasionally recall the strange taste of grass, the chilling sensation of dew on his wild, unkempt hair, the peculiar, savage freedom of madness? Did those recollections humble him when hall administrators flattered, or when adversaries cowered? The creature years had educated instructions that the throne years could never supply. The chronicle arrives full circle. We commenced with the unforgettable image of a shattered sovereign on hands and knees, hair matted, consciousness utterly surrendered. We conclude with the same individual restored to respectability, chastened forever by profound experience, infinitely wiser for having contacted the deepest depths of mortal vulnerability. Between commencement and conclusion lay a passage of 7 arduous years that transformed not just a single sovereign, but the world's fundamental comprehension of authority itself. Nebuchadnezzar had become far more than a historical figure. He had become an indelible parable of mortal aspiration, divine judgment, and merciful total restoration. His account would dramatically outlive his dominion. His madness would demonstrate itself more memorable than his subjugations. His humbling would educate more people than his triumphs. The precious metal head of the magnificent statue had descended and ascended again, fractured by harsh experience, but ultimately strengthened by profound comprehension. In surrendering his consciousness, the sovereign had discovered his soul. In becoming a creature, he had discovered what it genuinely signified to be mortal.